Chapter 6:15. Is this the place? Professor Shi Erfu tapped his magic wand lightly, and a cool breeze swirled and carried everyone to the ground. Claire Kate casually took out a magic card, moved her lips, and drew a circle of light with her as the center, instantly spreading out and disappearing in the blink of an eye. The originally noisy sound of insects and beasts quieted down in an instant. Professor Cheong Si strode forward and came in front of a towering tree, and slapped the tree trunk with his palm. Bang! With a loud bang, the giant tree actually began to shake with creaking sounds. At the place where his palm landed, the bark instantly split open, revealing the tree hole that was hidden within. A tree hole. Professor Cheong Si couldn't help but smile. Dake looked at the dark tree hole curiously and asked Cub Bear next to him, "Is this the tree hole?" Cub Bear stared at the tree hole for a long time, and stiffly raised the photocopy in his hand. The words gradually appeared on it. "It's a tree hole, but it's not my tree hole." According to the previous description, the hidden room it originally lived in was located under a tree hole, and after entering the tree hole, it had to go through an underground tunnel to reach its hidden room. And as the guardian of the hidden room, as long as it was still on the same level, it could sense the location of the hidden room no matter how far away it was. This was also the reason why it could bring Dake and the others here. However, the current situation was that it could clearly sense the hidden room, but this tree hole was no longer the same tree hole as before. It can only be explained that although the external environment has been refreshed, the hidden room inside has not changed. There are many reasons for this situation, and the most likely is that there is an elite monster left in the hidden room. In other words, someone has occupied your nest. Dake quickly analyzed. Cub Bear suddenly pouted. But Professor Shi Erfu looked at Dake with appreciation and said, "Good analysis. This is good news for us, because it means that at least we won't return empty-handed." Claire continued, "Perhaps the elite monster that took over the nest will become the breakthrough point. Professor Cheong Si, please go easy on him." Professor Cheong Si waved his hand and said, "I know my limits." After that, she directly went into the tree hole and took the lead to explore inside. Professor Shi Erfu quickly reminded him, "Pawa, slow down." Claire shook her head and said, "You guys go first. I'll stay behind." Then, she leaned back and let Dake and the others go first. Dake took a light breath, picked up Cub Bear by his feet, and followed him. Lily, on the other hand, flapped her wings and followed behind him with a relaxed expression. Professor Nini put Professor Ka Zayer on her shoulder and followed behind Professor Li Li. Claire walked at the back, and at some point, there was a monkey beside her. There was no danger in the tree hole. 8 people and 1 bear. Their journey was unimpeded. Not long after, the entrance to the hidden room appeared in front of them. Only then did Professor Jones slow down and reveal a cautious look. Although Cub Bear lived underground, it was very spacious. There were many rooms, and the bedroom in the deepest part was where the treasure chest was. According to D. Anna and the others, there were monsters in every room. They had to defeat these monsters to continue to move forward and reach the end. But in fact, these monsters were temporarily born by the mechanism of the underground city. Just like now, when Professor Cheong Si stepped into the room, the ceiling of the room suddenly rippled like water waves. Monsters that looked like wet clay fell from the ceiling and quickly condensed after falling to the ground, turning into earth elemental monsters with different appearances. Some of these earth elemental monsters were rock elemental monsters, while some were ground elemental monsters. They looked ferocious, with scarlet eyes and endless malice. Professor Cheong Si frowned slightly. Perhaps she didn't want to be dirted by the mud, so she took out a magic card and summoned it on the spot. Her lips moved, but she didn't make a sound. The magic card in her hand was shining, and a beast that looked like a lion or a tiger came out of the magic card. It then pounced on the monster at the front like a gust of wind. Warlord Liger Beast. A mere 3-star magic guide sprite. It was Dake's first time seeing Professor Cheong Si summon this magic fairy, and he couldn't help but feel surprised. Warlord Liger Beast was a super rare magic fairy among the 3 stars. It had a strong core that could transcend levels, and it was a model of getting stronger as it fought. Roar! After a roar, the nearest monster was torn apart by the warlord liger beast. It then raised its head slightly, and its whole body expanded visibly. Its 3 attributes also increased with its body size, and its aura became more ferocious. Then, the warlord liger beast pounced on the second and third monsters like lightning. When all the monsters in the field were killed, it was already a huge beast that was 3 to 4 meters tall. Its strength had even surpassed the second tier, reaching the third tier. What's the limit of this warlord liger beast? Dake couldn't help but ask. 9 stars. Lily flew to his side and said, specifically, its magic, attack, and defense can reach a maximum of 4,500. Dake then said, a 3-star magic fairy can reach the strength of 9 stars. It's already very scary. Lily giggled and said, that's not all. When the warlord liger beast reaches its limit, it can also trigger the fusion factor. 2 or 3 of them can fuse into a 2-headed liger beast, or a 3-headed liger beast. That's a genuine 4th-tier magic fairy. Dake couldn't help but say, this isn't mentioned in the books. Lily tilted her head and said, of course, this is Power's secret skill. You should watch more and learn more. As professors, we are very impressive. Dake said, indeed, it's amazing. Lily tilted her head even higher. With the warlord liger beast paving the way, the monsters on the 11th floor were almost no threat. They quickly crossed the entire hidden room and came to the deepest part. The bedroom? Woo-woo! As soon as Cub Bear entered the room, it opened its eyes wide and looked at the dazzling array of treasures in the corner. If there was anything in this dungeon that it couldn't bear to part with, it would be these treasures. They weren't in this hidden room from the beginning. They were collected bit by bit after it revived as a parasite. As for the treasure chest in the room, it was naturally the crystal necklace in Luo C's hands. However, compared to that necklace, Cub Bear clearly cared more about the fragments it had collected. At that time, as a prisoner, it couldn't bring these treasures out. But now, as a prisoner, it was fine. Cub Bear's little face suddenly shrank. Just as it was vexed over this, it suddenly heard an ear-piercing sound that sounded like tearing silk. Immediately after, the air in the entire room seemed to have frozen. It suddenly looked up and noticed that the half-elf named Sarah Shi Erfu was floating in the air. Her light golden long hair moved without wind, and a strange cyclone suddenly appeared around her hands. The wind blew in an instant. However, other than Professor Shi Erfu himself, no one else was blown by the wind. Other than Cub Bear, everyone else had a natural expression on their faces. The dark shadow in the corner of the room suddenly wriggled in this situation. Squeak! A sharp scream suddenly rang out. A sharp nose and mouth appeared in the corner of the shadow. A rat-like monster was forcibly dragged out of the shadow. We meet again. After a short moment of surprise, Dake smiled. He had a deep impression of this rat-like monster. Although he didn't know when he first saw it, after learning about Cub Bear's existence, he knew that this rat-like monster was the same kind of existence that had awakened its own self. And judging from its actions, it should have a deeper and more thorough understanding of the situation than Cub Bear. It was just that the underground city was so big that it was almost impossible to find such a monster. Who would have thought that after searching high and low for it, it would be so easy to find it? It hid in the shadow, and its breath was completely hidden, but it still couldn't escape the perception of the professors. Professor Shi Erfu only used a little force to forcibly pull it out of the shadow. After a while, the rat-like monster was tied up by layers of wind chains and suspended in the air, unable to move. Professor Shi Erfu carefully looked at it and suddenly said, "Is this the rat you mentioned?" Dake nodded and said, "It should be, unless it has a twin brother." Professor Shi Erfu smiled and said, "It seems that we are lucky. Osbrook was just a rat. Even before it became a monster, it was still a rat. But at that time, it belonged to the Demon King's army, and it was the terrifying Plague Lord. The plague it spread not only caused great panic in the human countries, but also affected the demon territory. Countless demon territory people died because of it, and the fear it spread to every corner of the world. But now, it was just a rat. It was once the boss of the first level, Shadow Demon Rat. Without the ability to control the plague, OSS Brook could only drag out an ignoble existence in the shadow. It lost all its glory and was no longer feared by people. Even the students who appeared in the boss room at that time dared to kill it. It was angry, it was sad, and it wanted to tear those students who despised the Plague Lord, one by one. Then, OSS Brook became a deserter. Snakes had their own ways, and rats had their own ways. After OSS Brook escaped, he gradually understood that he was resurrected in the Shang Malian Academy's underground city. Although it was a level boss, it was only the first level boss. If it went a little deeper, it would encounter powerful monsters that it couldn't handle. It was chased by monsters, hiding from the sight of the students, and finally, after a crisis, it awakened a new killing skill. That made it an extremely rare shuttle, which could shuttle between the levels of the underground city. Because of this, OSS Brook was chosen by Abyss, and became a stealth walker in the underground city. It was responsible for observing and discovering new members. This time, OSS Brook's target was Shirley Augustine, a parasite, living in the body of a small bear. Shirley Augustine had been around for a long time, but because it was only an elite monster, it was never taken seriously. But in recent years, things happened frequently, and the organization thought that there was a possibility that their information could be leaked. A crisis was coming. So, OSS Brook was ordered to recruit people, whether good or bad, and expand the organization's strength as fast as possible to fight against the coming crisis. So, OSS Brook came here. OSS Brook's heart was full of fear, and his bean-sized eyes stared at the golden-haired boy who left a deep impression on him. Out of the corner of his eyes, he inadvertently glanced at the bear cub at the boy's feet. At that moment, he seemed to understand. "Traitor!" OSS Brook roared in his heart. He didn't dare to say it out loud, for fear of angering the traitor. Although he didn't recruit the bear cub into the organization, he instinctively felt that everyone was a monster and should be on the same side. Shirley Augustine's behavior was a betrayal to all the monsters in the underground city. All kinds of subtle emotions were vividly displayed on the mouse's face. Dake's heart moved, and he said to the bear cub, "It seems that it knows you." The bear cub hurriedly shook its head like a rattledrum, raised the photocopy, and said, "But I don't know it, I don't know it, I don't know it at all." At this time, it was necessary to firmly draw a line with all monsters. Moreover, it really didn't know it. Professor Shi Erfu looked back at it and said, "Ka Zayer, suppression lock." Ka Zayer nodded slightly, took out the dungeon storage box, summoned a magic ring beside him, and reached his hand into it. When he retracted his hand, there was a jade ring the size of a bracelet in his hand. It was different from the suppression lock given to Dake. He took out one suppression lock instead of a pair. He threw the suppression lock to Shi Erfu. Shi Erfu put it on the mouse monster's head. OSS Brook wanted to struggle, but the suppression lock suddenly tightened and firmly clamped his head like a tight band. Then, he suddenly found that the flow of magic in his body was completely frozen, and he couldn't even mobilize a trace of it. This made him feel worse. "Can you speak?" Professor Shi Erfu tapped the magic wand on OSS Brook's forehead, and a clear voice directly entered his brain, translated into several languages that he could understand. OSS Brook felt as if he had heard static repeated many times at once, and his head suddenly swelled with pain. The next moment, he felt as if he was being stared at by a ferocious beast, and he felt a chill from the depths of his soul. He turned his head stiffly and saw Pawa Cheong-si, professor from the Shang Malian Academy. Of course, the professors would also enter the dungeon, and a few of them were regulars. Pawa Cheong-si was one of them. In the Abyss organization, the portraits of these professors had been circulating, but OSS Brook was very lucky. His sharp sense of smell helped him to avoid danger time and time again, and he had never met these professors face to face. Therefore, this was the first time. Perhaps it was also the last time. Before he met them, OSS Brook was actually quite disdainful. Those stupid monsters in the organization who had seen these professors were always talking about how powerful these professors were, and they were extremely exaggerated, saying that they were as terrifying as the Demon King. As a former Plague Lord, OSS Brooke thought that he had seen a lot, and he only thought that those monsters were covering up his failure and cowardice. Until the moment he really faced them, he suddenly realized that those monsters were not lying. He was even more frightened, and even his mouth started to tremble. Then he said in an extremely humble tone, "Of course, beautiful and noble elven lady. Those half-blood half-elven women like to be mistaken as elves," and even in his fear, OSS Brooke did not forget his little thoughts. But after Professor Shi Erfu confirmed that he could speak, he stepped back slightly and left the rest to Ka Zaire. Professor Ka Zaire slowly walked over and asked curiously, "Shadow Rat? Do you have a name?" OSS Brooke was tied up in the wind, and only his mouth could move. "Yes, Mr. Wise Goblin, you can call me Brooke. I'm just a dungeon rat that accidentally gained intelligence. But if you need help, I'll do my best." "Oh." Professor Ka Zaire suddenly laughed. Then, while OSS Brooke was completely unprepared, he suddenly said, "Where is the abyss?" OSS Brooke felt like his throat was being strangled at this moment, and large beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He had no idea how these professors knew about the abyss. Could it be that the parasite betrayed them again? But he clearly had not contacted the parasite yet. Could it be that another stealth walker had beaten him to it? Stealth walker? Professor Ka Zaire's next words were like a heavy hammer that directly hit his heart. OSS Brooke instantly understood that he was facing a person who could read his mind. It was not the kind of trick that played with people's minds, but the real thing. Professor Ka Zaire had the power to see through people's minds. Eye of truth. Door of truth. It seemed normal to add on a mind-reading ability. Dake was not too surprised. He just sighed in his heart. Professor Ka Zaire was really a virtuous and noble person. It was his good fortune to have such a professor. With Professor Ka Zaire around, OSS Brooke's lies were meaningless. Ka Zaire said calmly, "Don't worry, the Plague Lord is already dead." This sentence calmed Oth Brooke down. Along with Professor Cheong Si's deterrence, he quickly surrendered and told Cheong Si everything he knew. Although Oth Brooke's memories came from the famous Plague Lord, it didn't change the fact that he was just a shadow rat. Unless he dared to commit suicide and bet on the next dungeon reincarnation, he would have a chance to change his situation. But not all monsters were as lucky as Bear Cub Shirley Augustine. Most monsters, even if they awakened, would fall back into chaos after death. The Abyss organization that OSS Brooke belonged to called it Return to the Abyss. In the Abyss organization that worshipped power, OSS Brooke, as a shadow rat, could only be at the bottom and could not access the core secrets. But he was still a stealth walker. Even if he heard rumors, he still knew a lot. And this information was enough to surprise Dake and the others. Even though he had some guesses before, after confirming it, Professor Shi Erfu's face was still serious. When monsters awakened, it meant that they had the possibility to communicate with each other. And once they could communicate, they would form a community. The appearance of a monster organization was inevitable. But Shi Erfu still did not expect that there would be such a huge organization in the dungeon of the academy. According to OSS Brooke, there were at least 100 members in Abyss. There were a total of 100 boss-tier monsters. And there were even bosses below the 100th floor. But this was not the main point. After Professor Ka Zaire thought about it, he asked, "Brooke, do you know how you recovered your memory and awakened?" OSS Brooke took a deep breath and said, "The answer to this question is what we have been looking for. According to the higher-ups of the organization, the Abyss is guiding us. But of course, we will not be bewitched by such words. I am afraid that only the higher-ups of the organization know the real core secret." "Then what is the purpose of your recruitment?" Professor Ka Zaire asked again. But OSS Brooke shook his head and said, "I don't know. I used to think that it was to counterattack the surface. But later I found that the higher-ups of the organization did not have this idea at all. I used to be angry about it, but now it has faded." As he said that, he raised his head and quietly glanced at the professors. He suddenly understood the behavior of the higher-ups of the organization. In the face of these monsters that were like the Demon King, anyone would lose the idea of resisting, right? No wonder the higher-ups of the organization had been restraining the members from attacking human students. It seems that the leader of your organization is very rational. Professor Ka-Zayer nodded and said, "Maybe there is a possibility of friendly communication between us." As a professor who loved peace, Ka-Zayer obviously did not like to use violence to solve problems. He then said, "Then, who is the leader of your organization? Who is the core of the organization? Tell me everything you know." OSS Brooke knew that he could not resist, so he slowly said it. From top to bottom, the Abyss organization was divided into leader, advisor, captain, and executor. OSS Brooke was the hidden walker of the executor. The executor was under the jurisdiction of the captain. There were a total of 8 captains, and each team had at least 10 executors. OSS Brooke's captain was a Night Crow King, which was the boss of the 67th floor of the dungeon. As soon as he finished speaking, Professor Shi Erfu said in a low voice, "It is the Night Crow King?" I remember that there was a batch of students who were completely annihilated when fighting the Night Crow King, and they were all teleported to the infirmary. Later on, there were people who went to challenge the Night Crow King, but they couldn't find the coordinates of the boss room. So this was the reason. OSS Brooke said humbly, "The Night Crow King is cunning and sinister by nature. If you want to come into contact with it, it is best." Ka-Zayer asked curiously, "You want it to die?" OSS Brooke immediately shut his mouth. Professor Ka-Zayer shook his head slightly and said, "Continue. What kind of monsters are your leader, advisor, and captain? Who are their memories from?" OSS Brooke said, "They rarely talk about their past, and it is even more impossible for them to talk to an executor like me. However, other than the leader, I can tell what kind of monsters they are." Professor Ka-Zayer nodded and said, "Then let's start with the advisor." OSS Brooke immediately said, "The advisor of Abyss is a fog demon. It often transforms into a female human form, but no one knows what kind it is. Among the 8 captains, other than the Night Crow King of the 8th team, there is Red-Eyed Dragon Demon, 8 Treasure Spider Woman, Ice Emperor Bird." Half an hour later, Brooke finally finished telling them everything he knew. The base of Abyss was located on the 99th floor of the underground city. The lower the floor of the underground city, the larger the area. The 99th floor was already extremely vast. It was also very quiet. Basically, other than breaking the record to defeat the boss, no students would venture into such a deep area. However, the Shang Malian Academy had existed for so many years, and the record for defeating a boss was still at the 89th floor. It didn't even break through the 90th floor, let alone the 99th floor. However, in the past few years after the war, the professors would occasionally form a team to challenge the floors below the 100th floor during the holidays. The existence of the underground city was very important for the professor's strength to increase rapidly. "What do we do next?" Claire asked with great interest. Professor Shi Erfu turned to Ka-Zayer and said, "Ka-Zayer." Professor Ka-Zayer nodded slightly and took out a rubber tube from the dungeon storage box. Then, he pulled out the cork and placed it beside OSS Brooke's mouth. He said kindly, "Drink it." OSS Brooke looked at Professor Ka-Zayer with tears in his eyes. He said with a trembling voice, "Mr. Gnome, I've already cooperated. It's not poison." Professor Ka-Zayer smiled and said, "When you wake up next time, you'll be reborn." OSS Brooke's tears fell like rain. He didn't have the restraint of a plague overlord at all. Ka-Zayer stuffed the rubber tube into OSS Brooke's mouth. Then, he pressed OSS Brooke's chin and forced him to raise his head and swallow the potion. Gulp. The potion entered OSS Brooke's throat. OSS Brooke's eyes were filled with despair. Suddenly, his limbs convulsed, and his eyes lost their light. Ka-Zayer waited until OSS Brooke stopped moving before he said to Professor Shi Erfu, "It's done." Professor Shi Erfu raised his wand and spun it slightly to retract the shackles of wind around OSS Brooke's body. Brooke fell to the ground with a thud like a rag. Surely Augustine shuddered violently when she saw OSS Brooke being treated in such a manner. Professor Zaire seemed to have sensed her fear. He turned around and said gently, "It's just a tube of slumber potion." Cub Bear was shocked and instinctively grabbed Dake's trousers. Dake patted Cub Bear's head and said, "Professor, what do you plan to do next? Go directly to the 99th floor?" "I want to." Professor Shi Erfu looked regretful. "It's a pity that I don't have the key or crystal to the 99th floor. Pawa, Claire, what about you guys?" Professor Pawa Cheong-si shrugged and said, "I'm sorry, I only have the key to the 88th floor." Claire said helplessly, "Professor, when I was in the academy, I only managed to reach the 50th floor. Are all the students these days so good?" "Not really," Professor Shi Erfu said. "It's just that in recent years, some students have been particularly outstanding." "Zaire, do you have the key to the door?" Professor Zaire smiled and said, "I don't have the 99th floor, but I have the key to the 103rd floor." "What about you?" Professor Shi Erfu said helplessly, "Mine is the 108th floor." Professor Zaire said, "Then let's go directly to the 103rd floor. Mine is the crystal." Professor Shi Erfu said decisively, "Okay, let's go back to the living room first." Therefore, the professors decided on the next step in a few words. Although Dake wanted to say something, he didn't know what to say. In the end, he just shut up and didn't say anything. Professor Shi Erfu walked over and lowered his head, asking, "Shirley, do you want to stay here or go with us?" Cub Bear secretly glanced at the big rat that looked like a piece of ragged cloth and quickly raised the photocopy book. "Together." Professor Shi Erfu nodded slightly and said, "The things piled up in the corner are all yours, right?" Cub Bear's eyes lit up and nodded like a chicken pecking rice. Professor Shi Erfu waved his hand and stuffed the pile of things into his dungeon storage box. Then, he clapped his hands and said, "Let's go back." Half an hour later, the group returned to the living room on the 11th floor. They looked relaxed and didn't look much different from when they entered. The only obvious change was the shadow magic rat that Professor Cheong-si was holding in his hand. Everyone confirmed the schedule again and Zaire took out a door crystal and opened it on the spot. It was already 2 o'clock in the afternoon and the students entered the dungeon one after another. There was a group of 3 people in the living room on the 11th floor. The 3 of them suddenly saw the professors in the dungeon and were shocked. It was as if they suddenly saw the dean in the game and quickly greeted him. The professors nodded slightly and entered the portal one by one. When the portal closed like a whirlpool and disappeared completely, the 3 students heaved a sigh of relief and whispered to each other about the professor's intentions. Dake Dimming and the 2 monsters that followed the professors naturally attracted their attention. But no matter how they guessed, they couldn't guess the true intentions of the professors. The 103rd floor of the dungeon. The living room. "Professor, can I take some mana with me?" After Dake went through the portal, his eyes lit up as he stared at the mana marker in the living room on this floor. If he didn't take advantage of this opportunity, he might not have the chance to come to the 103rd floor for a long time. Whether it was to use it or to collect it, it was good to take some mana away. Professor Shi Erfu naturally wouldn't refuse. "Let's take a break here." Dake immediately took out the mana collector, and excitedly squeezed out the needle from the collector and started collecting mana. The mana marker on the 103rd floor of the dungeon was a white and fat seal. It was carved out of jade and looked very cute. Dake filled up all 20 slots of the mana collector, and put it away as if it was a treasure. The professors had somehow summoned a set of tables and chairs and sat down to discuss. When Dake walked over and sat down, they were talking about the leader of the Abyss. "What do you think about the leader of the Abyss?" Professor Shi Erfu was obviously trying to brainstorm ideas. Claire immediately said, "I haven't been to the 100th floor of the dungeon. I don't have the right to speak, right?" "Okay, I don't either." Dake immediately shut his mouth. "Then I also." Professor Nini mumbled timidly, "You guys." Professor Shi Erfu was rather helpless. Lily immediately laughed and said, "Let me say it, let me say it." Didn't that big rat say that the strong are respected in the organization? So, the leader of the Abyss organization must be a boss above the 100th floor. Have you guys ever had a boss that slipped away? Professor Shi Erfu slowly shook his head. Professor Cheong Si didn't say anything either. Professor Ka Zayer frowned slightly and said, I do have some ideas about this. But that was during our 3rd year at the academy. Do you still remember the Golden Mermaid's tears? Li froze and frowned. Golden Mermaid, the legendary tear. What's the story behind it? Dake asked. Professor Ka Zayer sighed slightly and said, according to the legends, the first mermaids were the children of the god of the sea. They had hair and fish scales that were as bright as gold, so they were called the Golden Mermaid. The blood of the Golden Mermaid could revive the dead. Just one bite of their flesh could extend one's life by 100 years. Their tears could rejuvenate an old man and make him stay young forever. When he spoke up to this point, Doc suddenly understood. Professor Ka Zayer's tone was slightly downcast. Of course, in the end, legends were only legends. Let's not talk about this for now. Professor Shi Erfu said sharply, you guys never talked about this before. Did you guys find the Golden Mermaid in the dungeon? Professor Ka Zayer nodded and said, the 120th floor of the dungeon, the boss, the Golden Mermaid. Professor Cheong Si immediately asked, did you guys fight it? Ka Zayer said, we successfully captured it alive. Professor Cheong Si said, I know that. After all, you guys needed the tears of the Golden Mermaid, and dead things don't cry. I mean, what happened in the end? Ka Zayer said quietly, after we confirmed that its tears didn't have the legendary effect, we left. Professor Cheong Si couldn't help but ask, you didn't kill it? How can you not kill it when you're fighting a boss? Professor Ka Zayer said helplessly, at that time, we were in a bad mood. Now that I think about it, we didn't even open the treasure chest in the boss room. Professor Cheong Si couldn't help but roll his eyes. Then, he pointed at his chest and said, do you know what I'm feeling now? My chest is twitching. Dake took a look. It was indeed twitching. Lily Professor quickly said, it's been so long. It's just that we let a tier boss escape. No way, right? No way, right? Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but cover his head. When a boss was first born, it would basically sleep in the boss room until someone stepped in. Perhaps it would develop consciousness in its sleep, but it would only be in a dream and would never wake up. When the door of the boss room was opened, it would be the time for them to truly open their eyes. Other bosses might be awakened by monsters that had awakened their consciousness, but the boss on the 120th floor of the dungeon. Monsters would also die if they were killed. According to the information revealed by Othbrook, the highest-ranked boss in the Abyss, including the strategist and the 8 captains, was a monster on the 82nd floor. Starting from the 101st floor of the dungeon, the difficulty would increase by another level. Even the boss monsters wouldn't dare to enter the dungeon below the 100th floor. In the Abyss, there was a rumor that the boss was a boss below the 100th floor. If this rumor was true, then the chances of the boss being the Golden Mermaid increased by a bit. The atmosphere in the living room gradually became weird. After a while, Professor Ka Zayer said, actually, I still have the door crystal on the 120th floor. Okay, Ka Zayer, I'm not blaming you. Professor Sylph sighed and said, even the reason why the Abyss organization is so orderly today is mostly because of the leader. I'm not saying that the chief of Abyss has to be a Golden Mermaid. Sai, just tell me what a Golden Mermaid looks like. Is it easy to communicate with her? Once it has its own consciousness, it's no longer a monster. Using force is the last resort. Professor Shi Erfu's meaning was very clear. However, Professor Ka Zayer looked away when he heard her question. Professor Shi Erfu froze and turned to Li, only to see Li looking up at the ceiling and whistling. Professor Shi Erfu suddenly had an ominous feeling in his heart. Don't tell me you guys have done something really bad? Seeing the awkward atmosphere, Professor Cheong Si knocked on the table and said, okay, Sarah. They want the tears of the Golden Mermaid. It's not easy to make the Golden Mermaid cry, so they have to do something. R18/127. I've been writing for a long time. I've used up 2 leave requests. Finally, it's done. Damn it, and don't be stuck anymore. O, greater than over equal to X, O. Chapter 616. Professor Shi Erfu was silent for a long time and agreed with Professor Cheong Si's words. Monsters didn't have self-awareness and lacked self-awareness. It was almost impossible to make them shed tears naturally. Ka Zayer and the rest didn't know that monsters could develop self-awareness. They must have used some special means. She thought for a while and decided not to mention it. But after a slight hesitation, Professor Kaiser said, "As far as we are concerned, the process of the monster's self-awakening is also gradual. They don't become complete in an instant. Instead, they gradually perfect themselves with the influx of memories. We didn't see any self-awareness from the Golden Mermaid, so we couldn't confirm if it had awakened. Therefore, I can't answer your question." Professor Shi Erfu frowned and thought that it was true. Ka Zayer continued, "But we can analyze it from another direction. That Shadow Fiend Rattus memories came from Plague Lord Othbrook. No matter what its temperament was at the beginning, after the memories flowed in, it gradually perfected itself, making it almost the same as the Plague Lord. As for Little Bear, as a parasitic spirit, it awakened when it was still the Ice Maiden. Its memories came from the Ice Maiden, Shirley Augustine. Even if it reincarnated as a parasitic spirit, it still retained the personality of Shirley Augustine. Their similarity is that they were all bosses at the beginning of their awakening. The bosses in the dungeon were originally the manifestations of these famous historical figures. Shadow Fiend Rat is like this, Ice Maiden is like this, and so will Golden Mermaid. In other words, as long as we find the Golden Mermaid that left an important footprint in history, we can deduce the identity of the Golden Mermaid and reverse engineer its personality. The Golden Mermaid didn't have a large population like the Shadow Fiend Rat. They were rare, and they were respected as the descendants of the sea god. They rarely left the seabed. Therefore, there shouldn't be many Golden Mermaids that left an important footprint in history. In my memory, there are only 2 Golden Mermaids that fit the criteria. The first one is the High Priest of the Sea Clan who once summoned a whirlpool hurricane to mince the Sea Clan's navy that invaded the Sea Clan. The other one is a princess of the Sea Tribe whose tragic love story has been passed down since ancient times. It is also said that the tears of the Golden Mermaid can restore one's youth and preserve one's youth forever. But these 2 are different from the Golden Mermaid boss that I saw. Do you have any other clues? The professors pondered over Professor Ka Zayer's explanation. After a while, Professor Shi Erfu said, "Have you heard of the Witch of the Sea?" Claire asked casually, "The legendary witch who often appears in storms and thunderstorms to guide the ship's course." Professor Shi Erfu nodded and said, "I grew up in the coastal area. When I was very young, I heard of the legend of the Witch of the Sea. When sailors went out to sea, they would often wear shells with the name of the Witch of the Sea engraved on them to pray for their safe return. Later, I investigated whether the Witch of the Sea really existed. Although I didn't go too deep into it, if I guess correctly, it should be a mermaid. I just don't know if it is the Golden Mermaid." "Now that you mention this, I suddenly remembered," Professor Cheong Si said. "In the Southern Sea, there is also a legend about mermaids. They are called the Light of Dawn. It is said that they come with the morning glow and bring the sea fish, pearls, and love to the coastal residents." The professors expressed their opinions, and Dake occasionally chimed in. As they spoke, they suddenly realized that there were so many legends about mermaids. What was even more uncomfortable was that although they couldn't confirm whether the mermaids in the legends were the Golden Mermaids, they couldn't confirm whether they were the Golden Mermaids or not. In the end, Professor Shi Erfu could only conclude, in short, most of the legends about mermaids are good. After all, they are the symbol of beauty and nobility among the Sea Tribe. They are not a threat to humans on the mainland, so they have a relatively positive image from the beginning. But as Ka Zayer said before, legends are just legends. It is not reliable to infer whether a Golden Mermaid is good or bad. Claire smiled and said, Then let's wait until we find one and understand it face to face. Professor Shi Erfu nodded and said, "It's almost time. Let's get ready to go." So everyone got up one after another and made the final preparations. Professor Shi Erfu said to Dake, "Next, we will go up from here to the 102nd floor, then cross the entire stratum to reach the reception hall on the 102nd floor. If we go against the flow from the reception hall, there is a high probability that we will appear in the depths of the stratum, which is extremely dangerous. Moreover, it is below the 100th floor. Therefore, you must follow Li closely." Dake took a deep breath and replied, "I will, Professor Shi Erfu." Then, Professor Shi Erfu looked at Li. Li hurriedly grabbed Dake's arm and said seriously, "Of course I will, right?" Professor Shi Erfu shook his head and said seriously, "Summon your magic guide sprites. I don't want any accidents to happen." Li, out of caution, the professors began to summon their magic guide sprites on the spot. They either used special summoning methods or directly sacrificed their sprites. Except for Professor Nini, every professor summoned a 4th-tier magic guide sprite. In normal life, it was almost impossible to see a 4th-tier magic guide sprite unless it was a duel between the top contestants. Dake was very curious about the professor's magic guide sprites and couldn't help but pay more attention to them. Professor Shi Erfu acted the quickest and was the first to summon a 4th-tier magic guide sprite. When the 4th-tier magic guide sprite appeared in the wind, Dake couldn't help but be shocked. He had thought about what type of magic guide sprite Professor Shi Erfu would summon, but he didn't expect her to summon a golden-haired sprite that looked exactly like her. The elven magic guide sprite had bare feet that were as white as jade, and a cool breeze flowed around its body, emitting a greenish-white light. It was wearing the traditional elven clothing, and its chest was smaller than Professor Shi Erfu's, but it was still like a mountain range. Its long hair was exactly the same as her, a faint golden color that swayed with the wind. The long ears that protruded from the golden hair were even longer than her, closer to that of a pure-blooded elf. There was a green wind rune shining between its eyebrows. Apart from its ears, its facial features were exactly the same as the elven sprite. However, its demeanor and aura were undoubtedly much gentler, and it gave off a gentle and delicate feeling. It looked like a gentler version of Professor Shi Erfu's pure-blooded elf. Dake was stunned for a moment. Suddenly, Professor Li whispered into his ear and giggled, "Do you want to know what Sarah's magic guide sprite is?" Dake said instinctively, "Yes." Li pulled his arm and shook it, then whispered into his ear, "That's Wind Sprite King, Shi Erfu." Shi Erfu? Dake couldn't help but be surprised. The Wind Sprite King was naturally the king of the wind sprites, and it had the authority to control the wind sprites. Of course, as a magic guide sprite card, the Wind Sprite King was just a clone, and its authority was limited. However, this wasn't important. What was important was its name. The name of this magic guide sprite card was actually the same as Professor Shi Erfu's surname. Seeing the surprise in his eyes, Li said proudly, "Do you think that Wind Sprite King, Shi Erfu, looks exactly like Sarah?" Actually, it's not that Wind Sprite King, Shi Erfu, looks like Sarah, but it's the other way around. Sarah and Wind Sprite King, Shi Erfu, look alike. Of course, I'm talking about the real Wind Sprite King, Shi Erfu. Li. Shi Erfu suddenly turned around and glared at her. Professor Li stuck out her tongue and hurriedly began to summon her magic guide sprite. Dake, on the other hand, was deep in thought. He knew that Professor Shi Erfu's father was a pure-blooded elf, and he was now running a tavern in Traveler's Street. However, other than that, his knowledge was limited. Since Professor Shi Erfu was a half-elf, then the other half of his bloodline definitely didn't come from a pure-blooded elf. So, Dake instinctively thought that Professor Shi Erfu was a hybrid between a pure-blooded elf and a human. However, that wasn't the case. How could an elf and a human give birth to a hybrid that looked exactly like the Wind Sprite King? He realized that he had taken it for granted. Meow. Suddenly, a huge tongue hung down from above and licked his face. He hurriedly took 2 steps back and saw the magic guide sprite that Professor Li had summoned. It was a strange-looking long-necked dragon. It looked strange because it had the head of a cat, the wings of a dragonfly, the 4 limbs of a turtle, the tail of a dolphin, and 2 dragon horns on its head. Dake had never seen such a strange creature. Even the legendary David's deer wasn't as strange as this. However, this magic guide sprite seemed to have a good impression of him. It meowed and licked his body. "Stop it." Lily patted the magic guide sprite's head and stopped it. Dake couldn't help but ask, "What kind of magic guide sprite is this?" Lily flew down and said proudly, "You've never seen it before, right? This is a magic guide sprite that only Lily has. Fantasy Fairy Dragon." Fantasy Fairy Dragon? Dake tried to reach out his hand, and the Fantasy Fairy Dragon lowered its round head and let him touch it to his heart's content. This Fantasy Fairy Dragon didn't have the aura of a 4th-rank dragon species. However, whether it was strong or not, it was still a 4th-rank one. Dake couldn't guess, so he could only look at the other professor's magic guide sprites for the time being. Claire aside, the 4th-rank magic guide sprite that Professor Pawa Cheong-si had summoned was, as expected, a giant bear. When the giant bear was first summoned, it was 15 to 16 meters tall, like a building. Its body was covered in layers of rock armor, and its tail was like a dragon's tail that supported its majestic body. Dake had seen information about this magic guide sprite in a book. This was a rock armor giant bear, a bird species that was of the earth/rock type. As long as it stood on the ground, it could absorb the power of the earth to rapidly heal itself. There was nothing special about the rock armor giant bear, it was purely strong. Its strength was extremely terrifying, and it could tear the earth apart with one claw. However, Dake had just blinked when he realized that Professor Cheong-si had activated another magic guide card, and the rock armor giant bear shrunk to a height of 3 meters at a speed visible to the naked eye. Magic spell card, Shrink. It was the complete opposite of the other magic spell card, Enlarge. Shrink would shrink the magic guide sprite's body and reduce its attack coefficient while increasing its defense coefficient by the same amount. After the rock armor giant bear shrunk, its defense almost doubled. Coupled with its high-speed self-healing ability, it was simply an unbreakable iron shield. After Professor Cheong-si, Claire had finally summoned her own magic guide sprite. Dake had thought that she might summon the rather handsome white tiger, but she had chosen an extraordinarily lazy fat lion. Regardless of whether it was the lion or the tiger, they were all kept sparsely in Claire's bedroom. If he hadn't seen with his own eyes that she had to sacrifice 3 times before summoning it, he wouldn't have thought that this fat lion that he often kicked around was actually a 4th-tier magic guide sprite. Phew! The fat lion that was summoned lay down lazily at Claire's feet. Time to work. Claire used her foot to push the fat lion's belly, and it finally moved, changing its position and continuing to lie down. Dake couldn't imagine what kind of magic guide sprite this ordinary-looking fat lion could be, so he could only ask Lily, who was beside him. Lily had an I-know look as he said, "Dust Lion, have you heard of it?" Dake's heart skipped a beat, and only then did he remember a little bit. Dust Lion was a type of magical animal in the natural world. They were born from dust, and were the same type of species as the Dust Sprite that was like a coal ball. However, Dust Lion and Dust Sprite were like dragons and ants. They weren't on the same level at all. The only similarity was that both could absorb dust and clean the room. Then what about Professor Ka Zayer's magic guide sprite? Dake turned to the 4th-tier magic guide sprite that Professor Ka Zayer had summoned and asked in a low voice again. In front of Professor Ka Zayer, there was a magic guide sprite that was as tall as a person emerging from the viscous liquid. The magic guide sprite had comma-like limbs, and its head and body were shaped like a plate. However, from the outside, it looked like a plate of jelly, and there was even liquid flowing inside. Dake had to admit that he had never seen such a magic guide sprite before. Good morning, 3. Chapter 617. It's a alchemy beast. Professor Lily tapped Dake's head and said, "If you pour milk into its body, it can produce cheese. If you stuff it with grapes, it can make wine. Not only that, Alchemy Beast can also synthesize metals and precisely shape them." Ka Zaire often uses it to make all kinds of precision parts and repair the school's patrolling statues. Dake dodged her fingers and said, "A top-level tool beast?" "Hee hee," Professor Lily said. "You can say that." Dake couldn't help but sigh. "I'm so envious." The name of this, alchemy beast, was related to alchemy. According to Professor Lily, it was very likely that it could shorten and simplify the alchemy process. This kind of magic fairy with both functions was very precious. Dake actually had a similar magic fairy, Kettle. Of course, Kettle and Alchemy Beast were very different in terms of functions, so they couldn't be compared together. He looked around again and withdrew his gaze. Remember, https://m Vipkanchu. VIP Professor Shi Erfu's Wind Fairy King Shi Erfu. Professor Li Li's Fantasy Fairy Dragon. Professor Cheong Si's Rock Armor Giant Bear. Claire's Dust Lion. Professor Ka Zaire's Alchemy Beast. There were a total of 5 of them, and each of them was at the 4th tier. With these 5 magic fairies, it should be enough to sweep through the 102nd floor. Professor Shi Erfu saw that everyone had summoned their magic fairies. He waved his wand and tapped them one by one. This time, everyone's feet were surrounded by a cyclone of wind. Dake tapped his feet and felt that his body was much lighter. He could jump into the air with a little force and walk with the wind. However, he turned his head slightly and saw that Professor Nini had already put Professor Ka Zaire on her shoulder. After all, Professor Ka Zaire was old enough to travel long distances. Professor Shi Erfu did not choose him in the beginning because he was old. Also, Professor Ka Zaire was a typical mage who stood still. He was not good at fighting while on the move. Therefore, after Professor Shi Erfu chose to invite him, he found Professor Nini, who could make up for his shortcomings. With Professor Nini around, Professor Ka Zaire would have an easier time. "Stop looking. Come with me." Professor Lily suddenly grabbed Dake's arm and brought him onto the back of the fantasy fairy dragon. Dake had been trained to ride a dragon before, so he didn't panic. He quickly found a suitable place to sit down. The fantasy fairy dragon's back was flat, and its neck was long and slender. It could be hugged easily. After he sat down, he looked at Professor Lily. Immediately afterwards, his vision blurred. Little Lily had already burrowed into his embrace, sitting on the dragon's spine with his little butt raised. Professor Shi Erfu glanced over there and said with satisfaction, "Since everything is ready, let's go now, Pawa." Professor Cheong Si nodded and drove the rock armor giant bear to walk in front. Then she took out a magic card and pasted it on her body. She changed into a full set of armor from head to toe. She was tall and big to begin with, so the armor she wore made her look even more heroic. Claire looked at Professor Cheong Si's broad back, and a trace of nostalgia flashed in her eyes. The magic card in her hand lit up and emitted an invisible field. The extremely lazy Dust Lion also stood up unwillingly and strolled beside her. Professor Shi Erfu's Wind Elf King Shi Erfu flew into the air and created a wind barrier to surround the whole team. Fantasy Fairy Dragon and Gold Refined Beast moved as well. Little Bear Cub and Otis Brook were thrown onto the back of the Fantasy Fairy Dragon. It was still the same formation as before. A group of people entered the passage and went up the stairs quickly. Soon, they arrived at the 102nd floor. What came into view was a scene of spring with blooming flowers. The lower the floor of the dungeon, the larger the area. Every floor was almost a small world. The environment of some floors was extremely ferocious, and there was no place to stay. But there were also some floors with excellent environments that made people linger. Dake looked at the blooming flowers and wanted to say that he was lucky. Then, he saw the Wind Elf King Shi Erfu floating in the air suddenly raise his hand with his palm facing up. Then, a horrifying vortex suddenly formed. After a short 2 or 3 seconds, fog suddenly appeared out of nowhere and was sucked in by the vortex. In the blink of an eye, the scene of flowers blooming in spring that one yearned for had completely vanished as if it had never existed. After which, countless scarlet eyes appeared around the entrance of the stairs. A humanoid monster with a huge flower on its head and a body made of plant roots quietly hid behind the herd of beasts. A thick fog was released from the flower bud in the center of the flower. Dake suddenly understood that the scene of spring blooming flowers was just an illusion created by this monster. But the professors seemed to be used to it and were not surprised at all. Professor Cheong-si's rock armor giant bear suddenly stomped on the ground. With a loud boom, the whole ground suddenly exploded. Countless amounts of soil rolled up and swallowed all the monsters around it. Even the humanoid monster with the flower petals on its head was crushed by the mud waves amidst its screams. A mirage flower. Professor Cheong-si turned to Professor Ka-Zayer and asked, "Do you need it?" Professor Ka-Zayer shook his head and said, "It's a pity that it's broken. Otherwise, it could be made into a specimen. It's quite rare." Professor Cheong-si said, "Since you don't need it, let's move on." With that as the beginning, the group quickly moved forward. The monsters on the 102nd floor were powerful and treacherous. They were very dangerous and hard to defend against. But in terms of knowledge and power, the professors here were the best in the world. They were cautious enough, so their path was smooth. Dake sat on the back of the fantasy fairy dragon and watched as the third-tier monsters were crushed and killed. He was shocked at the beginning and became used to it. In the huge and complex dungeon, the professors didn't even need to stop to find their way. They never got lost. In Professor Li Li's words, Professor Shi Erfu could listen to the sound of the wind. As long as there was wind, there was no path that she couldn't find. During this process, Dake finally saw how the professors fought. Professor Jones was a typical close combat warrior. Even though he was a mage, he liked to equip himself with weapons and armor so that he could fight alongside the rock armor giant bear. Professor Shi Erfu's Wind Elf King, Shi Erfu, seemed to be able to synchronize with her. No matter what kind of wind magic she used, it could copy and even strengthen it. Claire's Dust Lion was still as lazy as before. However, wherever it walked, the dust on the ground would condense into horrifying birds and beasts. Under its command, the birds and beasts would launch a sea of attacks against the demon beasts. Professor Ka-Zayer's Alchemy Beast was very mysterious. Dake just watched as Professor Ka-Zayer stuffed various materials into the alchemy beast. Then, the alchemy beast would continuously shoot out colorful light beams, flames, and cannons, blasting the monsters to pieces. As for Professor Li Li's fantasy fairy dragon, it meowed the entire time. Omega smiley face. Obviously, the monsters were the masters of the dungeon. But after the battle began, they were the ones who had the advantage in numbers. The normal monsters on the 102nd floor couldn't pose an effective threat to them at all. Under the guidance of Professor Shi Erfu, they perfectly avoided all kinds of traps and nests. They passed through the entire floor as quickly as possible and arrived at the meeting room on the 102nd floor unscathed. But even so, it was close to dusk when they arrived. After seeing the magic marker in the center of the meeting room, Dake's tense nerves finally relaxed. He grabbed the bear cub and got down from the fantasy fairy dragon. Then, he borrowed a new magic collection device from Professor Ka-Zayer and collected the magic marker's magic. The magic marker on the 102nd floor was a spire that went straight to the sky. If one looked closely, there seemed to be a figure moving inside. After he collected the magic, the professors had already spread out the field and used the gourmet card to summon all kinds of delicacies. The food problem that always troubled adventurers no longer existed after they had the gourmet card. But they didn't stop. After eating dinner, in just half an hour, they went up to the 101st floor. The dungeon at night was even more dangerous. But for the monsters on the 101st floor, it seemed that outsiders like them were more dangerous. In order to not have any accidents in the night shell, the professors unanimously increased their firepower. The coverage of the firepower increased by nearly half to ensure that no monsters could sneak up on them. It was not yet midnight. The group successfully passed through the 101st floor and arrived at the meeting room on this floor. Dake collected the magic as usual, and the professors began to set up the camp. Claire took out the Animal Kingdom field card and turned the entire meeting room into a paradise for animals. the professors didn't release their respective magic elves. With their magic recovery speed, it was enough to maintain these magic elves for a long time. Claire was known as the Sage of Beasts, but she had the least amount of magic other than Professor Nini. This was the disadvantage of humans, but it was also the opportunity for the birth of magical technology. Relying on the Animal Kingdom field card, she could maintain more magic elves for a long time. Dake and the others chose their own rooms in the Animal Kingdom as their temporary residence and quickly went to sleep. At night, there were scattered monsters that tried to approach, but they were all killed by the magic elves. The magic elves' methods were clean and neat, and they didn't even make too much noise. In the blink of an eye, the night passed. The glowing moss lit up the dungeon. The adventurers opened their eyes. Above the 101st floor was the 100th floor, and above that was the 99th floor of their destination. At noon, Dake and the others finally arrived at the meeting room on the 100th floor. They enjoyed lunch while continuing yesterday's topic. But among the people present, except for Professor Nini, no one was naive. Everyone was mentally prepared to fight if the communication failed. Monsters were monsters after all. Even though the professors were very lenient towards Shirley Augustine, and even though Othbrook's inner essence was the Plague Lord, they still didn't kill him on the spot. However, the line in their hearts was very clear. Once they couldn't communicate, they would be completely destroyed. It's time to wake her up, right? Professor Cheong-si walked over with Othbrook and threw him on the ground. Professor Shi Erfu nodded slightly. We still need her to lead the way. Professor Ka Zayer took out a tube of potion and poured it on Othbrook's nose. Othbrook suddenly shivered and let out a short scream, instantly waking up. But halfway through the scream, she suddenly realized that her voice had completely disappeared, and she immediately shut her mouth in fear. Professor Shi Erfu removed the mute card and pushed a plate of fruit over. Eat something first. Othbrook was stunned for a moment and immediately wolfed down the food. It wasn't that there weren't any fruits in the dungeon, it just wanted to show its submission attitude. Professor Ka Zayer glanced at him and said, "Tell me how to get to the abyss." Othbrook stopped and said, "Our base is built in a hidden room on the 99th floor, and there's a concealment barrier around it. If someone comes close, someone will lead them away. Unless they're members of the organization, they can't." Before he could say anything, Professor Ka Zayer already looked away and said, "I think I know where it is. Are you full?" Othbrook, not yet." Professor Ka Zayer nodded. "Then hurry up and eat." After Othbrook nervously ate the entire plate of fruit, he suddenly felt his consciousness become blurry, and his thoughts became sluggish. Then, with a plop sound, he fell on the table. Professor Ka Zayer took back the magic card and said, "It's not hard to find." It was indeed not hard to find. From entering the 99th floor to the entrance of the Abyss base, the professors only took 2 hours. The concealment barrier around the base was like child's play in front of Professor Ka Zayer. In fact, they even did the opposite. When they stepped into the boundary, they concealed themselves. As a result, they were not discovered until they arrived at the entrance of the base. "Is this the place?" Professor Shi Erfu slightly raised his head and looked at the ordinary mountain wall in front of him with a serious expression. "Yes." Professor Ka Zayer smiled and twirled the magic wand in his hand between his fingers, like a butterfly flying through flowers. In the non-maze dungeons, mountain walls, tree holes, and river bottom were all common entrances to hidden rooms. The hidden room in the Abyss base was no exception. However, the entrance to the base had obviously been modified, and it couldn't be triggered by normal means. According to Othbrook's memory, every time he entered the base, he would knock on the mountain wall 3 times and then open the door from the inside. In other words, there must be magical guards on the other side of the wall. In this case, unless there was something wrong with the guards' brains, they wouldn't open the door for uninvited guests like them. However, since they were uninvited guests, they had to follow the rules of uninvited guests. Professor Ka Zayer patted Professor Nini's shoulder, and the latter lifted him up and put him on the ground. He walked to the mountain wall and took out 3 hemispherical items from the dungeon storage box. Then, he threw them up and made the 3 items stick to the mountain wall. Then, a magical light suddenly shot out from the items and formed a triangle. Professor Ka-Zayer took 2 steps back and said, "Alchemy Beast." The alchemy beast immediately put down its black arm. Professor Ka-Zayer put a triangular item in its palm. It took the item and pressed it hard on its forehead, embedding it into its body. Then, a magical whirlpool appeared in the alchemy beast's transparent body. The triangular item on its forehead instantly released a triangular beam of light. After it was enlarged, it perfectly matched the triangle on the mountain wall. Half a minute later, the triangular beam of light suddenly shrank, and a triangular door that led to the inside of the base appeared on the mountain wall. The next moment, a siren sounded. Although the professors said that they were here for a friendly exchange, their actions were not friendly at all. Dake sat on the fantasy fairy dragon's back and couldn't help but stick the fairy puppet to his body. He wasn't worried about the professors, but he was worried about himself. As for little bear cub, it was lying on his back, shivering. The pressure from the monster bosses had already shrouded them like a dark cloud. However, the guard hiding behind the door poked his head out to take a look and immediately retreated. The alarm sounded even more urgent after that. Then, suddenly, the siren disappeared, the pressure retreated, and everything returned to silence. But at this moment, the atmosphere behind the triangular door was full of pressure. Professor Cheong-si stood with his arms crossed in front of his chest and smiled. "It's time to go in. Let's go." Professor Shi Erfu nodded. Then, with the rock armor bear taking the lead, everyone went through the triangular door and entered the hidden room, which was where the Abyss base was located. The Abyss organization hadn't existed for a long time. According to Othbrook's explanation, the Abyss was established after their leader appeared and recruited the monsters that had awakened one by one. That was how the Abyss reached its current scale. As if to make it easier for the monsters to come in and out, the entire hidden room was greatly expanded. The internal structure was like a mansion, and the walls on both sides were smooth and clean. The madness and bloodthirstiness of the monsters were not reflected in the architectural style at all. The exquisite decorations everywhere gave off a sense of liveliness. They didn't encounter any monsters along the way. The guard hiding behind the door had already escaped. It wasn't until about 3 minutes later that a monster finally blocked the path. Professor Cheong-si stopped, but the rock armor bear didn't stop. Roar! The giant bear's angry roar echoed in the sealed passage. It swung its dragon-like long tail and gradually sped up. Its sharp steel claws mercilessly stabbed at the monster's chest. But the monster instantly pulled out its sword and blocked the rock armor bear's steel claws with a giant broadsword that was more than 2 meters long. Clang! Sparks flew everywhere. The rock armor bear didn't hesitate at all and waved its claws at high speed, leaving glaring scratches on the broadsword. Finally, the monster couldn't take it anymore and took 3 steps back. But after 3 steps, it pushed its heels and raised its hands. Black tentacles crazily drilled out of its sleeves and wrapped around the broadsword like black snakes. Bang! The tentacles were completely imprinted on the broadsword, and pitch-black flames burst out. Ha! The monster suddenly roared and swung its broadsword, violently slashing at the rock armor bear's arm. A crack appeared on the rock armor giant bear's rock armor vambrace. But the crack healed in the blink of an eye. The rock armor bear suddenly opened its mouth, and a terrifying beam of light swallowed the entire passage. When the beam of light disappeared, the monster's body was already in tatters. The black flame armor that it had put on was shivering in the wind. Dake frowned as he recognized this monster. This monster was wearing a bamboo hat and black clothes. It held a broadsword in its hand, and it was very similar to the swordsman he encountered when he was fighting the boss on the 10th floor. But the difference in strength between the two was like heaven and earth. The broadsword user he saw and defeated was only at the 2nd rank, but this monster in front of him was almost at the 4th rank. So that's how it is. The one that was with Othbrook was just a clone? That makes sense now. The doubts that he had until now were all cleared up. Dake's eyes flashed as he thought about the first defeat that Senior Panduola suffered after entering the underground city. If the opponent was such a powerful monster, it was normal that she could not defeat it. But if it was really him, a monster that was almost at the 4th rank was only a boss on the 17th floor? Or did it become stronger after that? Human. While Dake was thinking, the monster suddenly opened its mouth, and its voice was a little magnetic. Professor Cheong-si immediately stopped the rock armor bear from continuing its attack and asked curiously, "Another one that can speak human language?" The monster held its broadsword and said, "Since you are here, you must have a rough idea. I was once the swordsman of the Mystic Beast clan, Oathbrook. When I woke up, I was the boss on the 17th floor. However, I have only used my clone to fight with others, and I have never really hurt the students of the academy." Professor Cheong-si thought for a while and said, "The swordsman of the Mystic Beast clan is a beast man?" Oathbrook slowly removed the bandages on his face, revealing a beast man face that was full of scars. Such a frank action dispelled Professor Cheong-si's doubts. She turned to look at Ka Zayer and saw Ka Zayer nodding at him. Professor Cheong-si was relieved and asked directly, "Oathbrook, bring us to see your leader." Oathbrook nodded slightly and was very cooperative. Maybe the reason why he appeared was to lead the way. Professor Ka Zayer sat back on Professor Nini's shoulder and looked at Oathbrook with narrowed eyes. He suddenly asked, "When did you know that we would come?" Oathbrook's back was facing them as he led the way. When he was asked this question, his expression did not change at all. However, Professor Ka Zayer already knew what was going on. "I see, your fog demon advisor has the ability to divine. Its memory came from the Star Tower astrologer?" Oathbrook's shoulders trembled as he could not hold it in anymore. "Continue." However, Professor Cheong-si said calmly behind him. Oathbrook paused for a moment and could only continue walking forward. After about 5 minutes, they finally arrived in front of a door after taking a few turns. This door was actually a golden door. The door was decorated with very complicated and exquisite patterns. At the upper part of the door, there was a round ocean blue pearl inlaid in a very exaggerated manner. The professors looked at each other and suddenly felt more confident about their previous guesses. The leader, behind the door, maybe it was really the Golden Mermaid? They just did not know which of the many legends it was. Dang, dang, dang. Oathbrook raised his hand and knocked on the door. The golden door opened automatically from the inside. A majestic water vapor suddenly surged out, making people feel slightly uncomfortable. The entrance was blocked by a partition. After passing through the entrance and walking into the room, they could see the scene inside. Excluding those insignificant decorations on the wall, the most important equipment in the room was undoubtedly the rectangular conference table in the middle. On both sides of the long table, there were square chairs of different sizes. The chair on the main seat was the most luxurious and luxurious. At this moment, there were already a few people sitting at the conference table. The higher-ups of the Abyss organization were waiting solemnly. Professor Cheong-si was the first to enter the room. Her gaze swept across the entire room in an instant and took in every corner of the room. At this moment, the rock armor giant bear was walking behind her with an imposing manner like a mountain. She walked straight to the front of the conference table and casually pulled out a chair. She sat down very naturally and then supported her chin with her hands as she carefully observed the demons in the room. Professor Shi Erfu followed closely behind and sat down on the seat opposite the main seat without any hesitation. Wind Elf King, Shi Erfu, floated behind her as if it was a substitute. "Welcome to the Abyss." At this moment, the leader on the main seat invited them. Its voice was deliberately hoarse. Claire, Professor Ka Zayer, Professor Nini, as well as Dake and Professor Li Li, who were walking at the back, all took a look at it and then sat down one after another. Dake sat between Claire and Professor Li Li, on the right-hand side of Professor Shi Erfu. Professor Cheong-si, Professor Ka Zayer, and Professor Nini sat on the left-hand side. Orsbrook was casually thrown outside the door, but the bear cub, Shirley Augustine, was brought in and placed on a chair by Li Li. Of course, it was frightened by the tense atmosphere in the conference room and was pretending to be Li Li's teddy bear. The higher-ups of the Abyss were not all here. Dake recalled Orsbrook's words as he observed and compared them. There were only 6 higher-ups in this conference room. Sitting on the main seat was the leader, but it was shrouded in a thick mist like a water elemental sitting on a chair. A pearl bigger than its head floated above its head. Dake resisted the urge to use the Eye of Truth, and looked at the leader's side. On the seat closest to the leader's left, the legendary Fog Demon Advisor was sitting quietly. The Fog Demon turned into a female form. It put its hands on the table, and a crystal ball floated in the air between its 2 hands. On the opposite side of the Fog Demon sat the Ice Emperor Bird. The Ice Emperor Bird was a superior species of the hubby, and it was a harpy. It had a female head and body with long hair, and its arms and wings were fused together. Below its thighs were huge bird claws. The Ice Emperor Bird's hair color and wings were icy blue with white light, like ice crystals, emitting a cold air. Its face was also like its attribute, like a cold beauty. Although it was a demon, it obviously had a sense of shame, and it used its feather-woven chest to cover its important parts. The remaining 3 higher-ups all sat on the right side of the Ice Emperor Bird, and they took up half of the 8 captains. The Night Crow King and the Red-Eyed Dragon Demon weren't there, but the 8 Treasures Spider Lady could be seen. The 8 Treasures Spider Lady was a demon with a human upper body and an 8 Treasures Spider lower body. There were a total of 8 pearls on its spider body, and they looked like 8 huge eyes. Its body was an extremely normal human body, and it wore soft armor and carried a longbow on its back. It was obvious that it was an archer. Beside the 8 Treasures Spider Lady were the Pigman and the Snake-Haired Witch. The Pigman wasn't a pig, but a huge pigman. Its height and width were similar, and its face was full of fat. Although it wasn't ugly, the oil that kept flowing down its body made people want to avoid it. The Snake-Haired Witch was a subspecies of Medusa, and some Nagas were called that after becoming witches. The Snake-Haired Witch, in front of them, was obviously the latter. The biggest difference between them was whether their lower body was a human or a snake. The Snake-Haired Witch had beautiful facial features, a long neck, and a graceful body. Her waist was as slender and soft as a snake, and her legs were long and round. She only wore a tight-fitting witch robe, and she looked weak and boneless. The Pigman and the Snake-Haired Witch sat together, and they were like 2 extremes. The atmosphere was a bit tense. These demon bosses were in their own territory, but they didn't have any aura at all. Instead, the outsiders, the humans, had the upper hand. Professor Shi Erfu was the first to speak and break the silence. Since you're already sitting here, it means that you're rational enough and willing to communicate with us in a friendly manner. So, let's start with self-introductions. We'll talk after we get to know each other. What do you think? The mist on the main seat moved, and the leader's voice came from it. Okay. Professor Shi Erfu said with a serious expression, then, as the host, you go first. The mist trembled violently, and then the pearl on top of its head started to spin. The mist slowly fell from the top to the bottom like a tide. At this moment, the other demons couldn't help but look over. According to Orsbrook, no one in the Abyss organization had seen the leader's true appearance. These high-level demons probably didn't expect that the leader would reveal his true appearance for the first time. Last night, the leader summoned all the 8 captains through the strategist, and had an emergency meeting overnight. That was why today's scene was happening. Although they were in their own territory, every demon knew that they were the weaker side. Not to mention how powerful the professors were, even the entire underground city belonged to them. It meant that there was a knife on their necks from the beginning to the end. If the Shang-Malian Academy wanted to, they could close the underground city at any time and never let them see the light of day again. Although they didn't know if the Shang-Malian Academy could do it, they thought that it could. So in the end, they were really living under someone else's roof. The professors of the outsiders were the real hosts of this event. The leader of the Abyss organization obviously knew this very well. He didn't think of resisting from the beginning. At this moment, he obediently removed the mist around his body and revealed his true appearance that he had never shown before. But as the mist gradually fell, the people in the room suddenly felt that something was wrong. Why is it that the leader's head isn't at the normal neck position? This question caused a small question mark to appear in almost everyone's mind. Only little Li kept blinking his eyes, and Professor Ka-Zayer took a deep breath. Whoosh! The mist suddenly dissipated, and the leader's true appearance was completely exposed. The high-level demon's expressions froze for a moment. Dark and the rest of the professors also had a shocked expression on their faces. Then, Professor Shi Erfu suddenly stared at Professor Ka-Zayer. Ka-Zayer! Professor Ka-Zayer looked away again. On the spacious seat, there was a golden mermaid, with long golden hair and fish scales sitting on it. She wore a pearl necklace and a seashell around her chest. Her skin was as white as jade, and her face was extremely tender. Her eyes were so bright that it seemed like there were 2 pools of water hidden in them. Other than being a little younger, she was no different from the golden mermaid that everyone expected. Well, other than being a little younger. The boss of the 120th floor of the dungeon was a golden mermaid cub that looked like she was 11 or 12 years old. Of course, if it was just a demon, no one would care about its appearance and age. Because appearance was just a shell to a demon, and they didn't have a matching soul. But once a demon had a sense of self, everything would be different. Even Dake couldn't help but wonder how Professor Ka-Zayer made her cry. But then again, he also understood why she had to hide her true appearance in front of the other demons. How could she possibly control those powerful demonic bosses when she looked so weak that she could be crushed at any time? The Golden Mermaid, who had revealed her true appearance, looked like a little tearful bag. The Golden Mermaid looked at the reactions of the demons and humans with tears in her eyes. Without the mist, her voice sounded a little childish. As you can see, I am the royalty of the mermaids. I am the Golden Mermaid, Asalia Pettus. You should know that appearance doesn't determine a person's character, so don't look at me like that. Leader Asalia Pettus tried to make herself look serious, but the demons all stared at her with their eyes wide open. Their expressions didn't change at all. Obviously, the moment she revealed her true appearance, she had lost her dignity. Unless she showed her power on the spot and used her power as the boss of the 120th floor to re-establish her dignity and remind them of her terrifying power. But now was not the time. Also, Asalia Pettus couldn't be tough at this moment. She pursed her lips and looked at Ka-Zayer. She said timidly, "Now it's your turn." Professor Sylph retracted her gaze and introduced herself to Asalia. She then briefly explained the purpose of her visit. Asalia nodded slightly and said, "Can I understand that you came with good intentions?" "Good intentions are mutual, isn't it? If you can tell us the whereabouts of the other 4 captains and how you can awaken the monsters, we'll be kind." Professor Sylph said calmly, "If you can tell us all about the whereabouts of the other 4 captains and how you can awaken the monsters, we'll be kind." At this point in the conversation, the monster bosses finally stopped staring at Asalia. Asalia pursed her lips and said, "My strategist made a prophecy yesterday. He said that we will welcome a new life today. The captains who didn't want to welcome the new life all chose to leave. They took some of the executors with them. They are no longer related to the abyss." Professor Shi Erfu turned to Ka-Zayer. Professor Ka-Zayer nodded and said, "Yes, they ran away." Professor Shi Erfu turned back and said, "I can think of the reason why they chose to run away. But since you chose to stay, does it mean that you are willing to accept our arrangement?" Aisha glanced at the strategist on her left and said, "It's like this. Of course, we will do our best to fight for our own interests without causing any conflict." Professor Shi Erfu nodded and said, "Then let's continue the unfinished introduction. Asalia Pettus, why are you remembered by history?" Asalia Pettus took a deep breath and said, "The glazed lamp. I broke the glazed lamp of the god of the sea and caused the climate to go out of control. 10 years of thunderstorms and hurricanes prevented the Oceanids from rising to the surface. They spent 10 long years in the undersea god kingdom without seeing the sun. You are the princess of the Oceanids who broke the god of the sea's lamp?" Lily suddenly said. Her eyes were bright, and her curiosity was almost overflowing. Asalia Pettus glanced furtively at her, and then straightened her face, and pretended not to recognize her. Professor Shi Erfu thought carefully and turned to the fog demon strategist and said, "Then, can I ask this Star Tower astrologer to introduce herself? Also, although your disguise is realistic, it shouldn't be necessary in the future." The military advisor smirked, and the fog around him suddenly dissipated. There was no longer a trace of the fog demon aura. The one sitting on the chair was a real human woman. Correction, although my appearance and memories came from the Star Tower astrologer, I am not her. Military advisor said with a faint sense of rationality in his tone. 19/127, Good evening, 3, although it was a bit slow, it wrote 10,000 this time. Keep up the good work, keep up the good work. Try to update tomorrow morning. Chapter 6:18. In the dungeon of Shang Malian Academy, elite monsters or bosses with pure human appearances were not uncommon. Those human powerhouses who had left important footprints in history would occasionally be projected by the dungeon to fight with the students. The military counselor in front of him was one of them. But unlike other monsters who gradually mixed themselves up with their original bodies after obtaining their memories, it was very clear that it was just a brand new individual with the appearance and memories of the original body, not a real resurrection. It was just that this rationality also came from that memory. And it was actually very unfavorable for them to state this fact clearly. Because if it was resurrected, it would be the original body. If it was not resurrected, it would still be a monster. Just like Xiong Bao's previous concerns, the monster bosses present, except for the military counselor, were more willing to be regarded as the resurrection of the original body. Even Asalia Paetus called herself the Princess of the Sea from the beginning. But the military counselor exposed this point. Website https://m Vipkanchu VIP Dolores Stark. This is the name of the original body in my memory. She was an astrologer of the Star Tower and once predicted the defeat of the demon race. Of course, I don't mind if you call me Dolores. Dolores Stark said faintly with a trace of pride in her tone. Although it did not think that it was Dolores Stark herself, it was still proud of it. Dolores Stark was a very famous hero in the history of the war between humans and the demon race. When humans were at a great disadvantage, she bravely predicted the defeat of the demon race and personally went to the front line to encourage the morale of the soldiers. Although she was eventually assassinated by the demon race, her death also thoroughly aroused the resistance of the human and subhuman soldiers. Her name was still engraved on the hero tablet in the Star Tower. After the professors heard this name, they were all touched. But it was just touching. They also knew that the Dolores Stark in front of them was not the original body resurrected. The monster body copied by the dungeon was significantly different from the real human body in the core, and it was impossible to confuse them. Dolores Stark was known as the Revelator in history. If her resurrection was announced to the world, it would inevitably set off a huge storm in a short period of time. However, when people came to their senses, it was very likely that there would be a rebellion. Because of the existence of Dolores Stark, the monster. To the dead, it was a kind of blasphemy. Because of this, it was very difficult to decide how to deal with these demonic creatures. Professor Shi Erfu took a deep breath and said, "Let's talk about Stark later. If my guess is correct, there's no need for the rest of you to hide your identity. Why don't you tell me everything at once?" The remaining demonic creature bosses looked at each other and said one after another. The original form of the Ice Emperor bird was a harpy that lived in an extremely cold place. It was not a human, but it was the guardian of a small human country. It had protected the small country from the harsh environment for hundreds of years. The original experience of the Octogem Spider Lady was very similar to the Ice Emperor bird, but it protected the forest elves and was once worshipped as a totem by the forest elves. As for the pig man and the snake-haired witch, their original bodies belonged to the orc race, and each of them was a hero of the orc race. In other words, the 6 higher-ups of the Abyss present were all good characters in their original bodies. They did not need to hide their identity, nor did they need to worry about being treated badly because of their original bodies. This was the main reason why they were sitting here. In other words, The other 4 captains, who chose to escape, were all bad characters in their original bodies. The dungeon was so big that if the 4 captains wanted to hide, even the professors would have a hard time finding them in the corner. Their choice was not wrong for them. After the monsters introduced themselves, the professors also briefly introduced their identities and names. In this way, the 2 sides could be considered to have a mutual understanding of each other, which was more beneficial for the following discussion. The Golden Mermaid, Asalia Patis, first explained the cause and purpose of establishing the Abyss organization. Everything started a few years ago. Professor Ka-Zayer and the other 2 went deep into the dungeon during the holidays to find the tears of the Golden Mermaid. In the end, they came to the boss room on the 120th floor of the dungeon and found Asalia Patis. After a battle, Asalia Patis was captured alive. She intentionally skipped over what happened after that. In short, she was spared after that and got rid of the restraints of the dungeon on monsters. She relied on her own will to walk out of the boss room. At that time, she was in the stage where her memory was quickly recovering, and her personality was quickly becoming similar to her original body. Her temperament was completely consistent with her appearance. She cried as she wandered. Because she was afraid of killing monsters, because she was lonely, she tried to catch monsters and raise them. Later, she mistakenly entered the meeting room and found the stairs to the upper floor. Only then did she know what kind of world she was in. She subconsciously began to climb up, only thinking that if she kept going up, one day she would be able to escape from the dungeon and return to the surface. But when she climbed up to the 99th floor with difficulty, she met the first monster that had awakened. From that monster, she learned a lot of information that she did not know and learned how to disguise herself. After that, she met military counselor Dolores Stark, and for the first time, she had the idea of forming a force. Dolores Stark had also been thinking about how to ensure her safety when she returned to the surface, and the appearance of Asalia Patis was also an opportunity for her. In short, our original purpose of establishing the Abyss organization was to obtain a bargaining chip. Asalia Patis was very honest. We never wanted to go against the Academy from the beginning. We understood that there were more magic beasts awakening in the underground city, so we gathered them. Only by building a strong enough collective can we negotiate with the Academy on an equal footing. You won't be crushed like an ant that crawls onto a dining table. Professor Shi Erfu smiled after hearing this and did not say anything. Asalia Patis glanced at her and continued, "Although we are not strong enough now, we are sincere enough, so," Professor Shi Erfu slowly said, "state your requirements." Asalia Patis pursed her lips and said, "First, safety." Professor Shi Erfu nodded and said, "This is the foundation." Asalia Patis immediately let out a sigh of relief and tried to say, "Then freedom." Professor Shi Erfu frowned slightly. Asalia Patis hurriedly said, "Of course, it's relative freedom." Professor Shi Erfu said, "You need to come out of the dungeon and come under the Academy's management. In return, the Academy will provide you with what you need, and after a review, you will be given relative freedom. As long as you cooperate, we will consider your opinions and give you preferential treatment." Asalia Patis could not help but look at the others. Seeing that the higher-ups did not refute, Asalia nodded and said, "In principle, we can accept, but the details need to be discussed and the contract drawn up." The conversation between the 2 sides quickly progressed. The monsters had never thought of going against the Academy from the beginning. This was the key to making the conversation go smoothly. However, the Abyss organization had in fact been divided into 2 parts. Those who stayed here were the ones who chose to defect, and the ones who were really difficult to deal with were the ones who left. However, Asalia could also provide a detailed list of those who left so that the Academy could find and deal with them. The entire conversation lasted for 3 hours. Professor Shi Erfu finally promised to provide them with a place to stay in the dense forest, and according to the results of the review, facilities such as Traveler Street would be gradually opened. However, the monsters had to wear the restraints made by Professor Ka-Zayer, and they could not have too much contact with the students. In addition, there were actually a large number of monsters hidden in the dungeon who had already awakened. The strategist of the Abyss, Dolores Stark, had the special ability to search for these monsters. Professor Shi Erfu planned to set up a department under the Academy's jurisdiction to replace the Abyss and take over these monsters. He would also provide the corresponding jobs and let them shoulder the responsibility of searching for these monsters. With this as the core, the two sides finally drew up a temporary contract and signed it on the spot. The whole process was so smooth that it made people wonder if they were negotiating with the monsters. However, the reason for this was actually because of the absolute power of the Academy's professors. Under the supervision of Professor Ka Zayer, nobody could lie. I hope that our cooperation will continue to be pleasant. Professor Shi Erfu arranged the contract and said calmly, "Let's continue. Let's move on to the next segment." Reaching an agreement with the Abyss organization was actually an unexpected gain. This wasn't the initial purpose of Dake and his companions when they entered the dungeon. They didn't even know about the existence of such an organization. Their true purpose was to find the source of the monster's awakening. After reaching an agreement with the Abyss organization, they finally had a clue about the source. The clue was actually beneath their feet. On the surface, the Abyss organization's base was in a hidden room, but that wasn't the case. They weren't in a hidden room, but a hidden space. Hidden space and hidden room were only a word apart, but the meaning was completely different. Professor Shi Erfu was quite surprised when he heard this. They kept the contract and followed Asalia and the other monsters out of the conference room. Then, they went deeper into the dungeon. Asalia took the lead and said, "Just like you're looking for the reason of the monster's awakening, we're also looking for the reason of our awakening. We call it the source. The reason why we chose to build our base here was because it was the closest place to origin that we could find. The hidden spaces mechanism allowed us to surpass the dungeon's hierarchy and close the distance to the source. However, we still can't touch it." "How far is it?" Professor Shi Erfu interrupted her. Asalia said, "It's just ahead." It was indeed just ahead. After Doc heard those words, he took a step forward. His vision suddenly changed and he entered the cold cave from the modern passageway. He was taken aback and suddenly noticed that his hand was grabbed by Li Li. The professors stopped in their tracks, and they looked solemn. A scalp-numbing aura emanated from the end of the cave. Asalia turned her head and said in a low voice, "Follow me." They continued forward. After only 3 minutes, the so-called source appeared in front of everyone. It was a huge heart hanging on the mountain wall. Thump, thump, thump. Doc suddenly covered his heart, and the sound of his huge heart beating suddenly echoed in the cave, causing the hearts of all the people and monsters to gradually beat in sync with it. Their blood flowed quickly as if it was boiling, and their skin turned red. Clap. Asalia suddenly clapped her hands, and the huge pearl above her head spun, releasing a water curtain in front of everyone. The water curtain began to beat rhythmically, but it reduced the impact of the huge heart beating. Everyone's expression quickly returned to normal. Professor Shi Erfu took 2 steps forward and said in surprise, "This is the source you mentioned?" Asalia nodded and said, "But it doesn't really exist here. It's just a projection like a mirage. Fortunately, we can't get close to it. Once we get close to it, we can't help but bow to it. It's as if everything in our body was given by it, and we can't help but give ourselves to it." When she said this, Asalia's legs were trembling. She was obviously trying to control it. The other monsters were no exception. If they continued to move forward, they were likely to throw themselves under the huge heart, prostrating themselves on the ground and offering their lives. Even if it was just a projection, they couldn't extricate themselves. The hidden space allowed them to see the projection of the source, and made them realize their own insignificance. What level is the projection of this huge heart on? Where is the projection's body? Dake stared at the heart, and the idea of finding something related to God to complete the great sin quickly faded away. The goddess of the moon in the secret passage contained very little God's will, which made him think that he wasn't careful enough. The God hidden in the underground city was obviously more complete. With his current strength, there was no way he could come in contact with it. Pride -1. A system prompt suddenly appeared in front of him. Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he couldn't help but smile. "What are you smiling about?" Li whispered into his ear. Dake blinked and said casually, "Look at the projection of the heart. Which level should it be?" "Level, boss?" Li was startled and asked suspiciously, "Why do you think that the heart's projection is a level, boss?" "Wait. Li's eyes suddenly widened, and she hugged Dake and exclaimed, "Yes, it's a level, boss." Since the level bosses of the Shang Malian underground city were all projections of people who left important footprints in history, why couldn't they be gods? In the complete history of this world, was there anyone who left a more important footprint than the gods of the past? The reason why they had never thought of this was because they felt that the level of the gods was too high, and because they had never seen one before. But the reason why they had never seen one before, wasn't it because the level of the gods was too high, so the level bosses that simulated them were all at the lowest level of the underground city? Conservatively speaking, it should be at least 200 levels below, right? Li suddenly had an idea, and she suddenly felt that she was too smart, and she couldn't help but smile proudly. Then, her smile was pushed aside by Dake's palm. "What are you talking about? What level, boss?" Claire was originally carefully observing the giant heart, but she couldn't help but turn around and ask with narrowed eyes. Dake and Li quickly became the focus of attention. Before Dake could speak, Li had already turned around and said excitedly, "I found a secret." "I see. Is this the secret you were talking about?" Claire said with some regret, "I only broke through to level 50, so I'm not qualified to participate in this topic. But the level bosses of the underground city are originally stronger the lower you go, and when they reach the limit, they will naturally become gods. Since we haven't been able to see the level of the underground city, it's not wrong to assume that there is a level boss below that is close to gods." Professor Cheong-si crossed his arms and said, "It seems that you all think this is God's heart?" "It can only be God." Professor Shi-Erfu raised his head and looked at the pitch-black chains that hung the heart, deep in thought. Professor Ka Zayer said, "Your hypothesis is interesting, but how can a heart be a level boss? Unless it's still in the process of being created." Ka Zayer suddenly froze and said, "The underground city is creating its god." The magical creatures couldn't interrupt the discussion at all. Professor Shi-Erfu pondered for a short while and shook his head. "Let's follow the normal train of thought. Why can't someone seal a god's heart in our underground city in the past, and then the hidden dimension accidentally opened, causing its aura to leak out?" "I agree with the second half of the sentence," Professor Ka Zayer said. The underground city hadn't had such a change for so many years. Now that it suddenly appeared, there must be a decisive difference. If there wasn't any external force, it could only be a coincidence. As for how the huge heart appeared in the underground city, it would take a lot of time to research and discover. Professor Ka Zayer straightened his body subconsciously, and his wrinkled face was full of excitement. It was obvious that this huge heart had given him a great passion for research. However, from the perspective of the Academy, the existence of such unstable factors was not a good thing. Therefore, Professor Sylph's expression became more and more serious. As for the other professors, Claire was no longer a professor. Professor Cheong-si wasn't very interested in the heart. Professor Li was full of curiosity. Professor Nini was still in a daze. At this time, the magical creatures had retreated to the corner and formed a small circle. Asalia and Dolores whispered to each other. The other 4 demonic creatures chimed in. They were surprised by the words of the professors. They didn't understand why the professors were so sure that the huge heart was the heart of God, and they didn't understand why they were so calm after coming to this conclusion. They were originally heroic figures, but the change of times had obviously created a generation gap between their thinking and the people of today. Based on their reverence for God, they couldn't imagine the actions of the professors. Therefore, they were even more secretive about the professors. The beating of the huge heart put a lot of pressure on the magical creatures. They didn't stay inside for too long, and the professors didn't stay any longer after they left. In order to research the huge heart, the first thing to do was to find the hierarchical position of the projection, then trace it back to the origin of the heart from the projection. But this was difficult to do in the short term. Even Professor Ka Zayer didn't rashly choose to start the research at this time. After all, it was related to God, so he needed to be more careful. Also, due to the existence of the hidden space. If he accidentally destroyed the projection of the huge heart, it would easily cause the space to collapse, and then it would be even more difficult to trace it back. On the other hand, today's harvest was completely beyond their expectations. They needed to return to the academy as soon as possible and inform Principal Aerti about what happened today. We need at least one door key or door crystal to go to the 99th floor. When they returned to the conference room, Professor Shi Erfu quickly said, "From the 99th floor to the first floor, only door key 1 or door crystal 1 were needed." They had both of these items. But if they wanted to come to the 99th floor again, door key 99 or door crystal 99 was very necessary. "I have a door key to the 99th floor." Asalia expressed her sincerity. After Professor Shi Erfu accepted the door key 99, he asked gently, "Are all your members here?" Asalia shook her head and said, "We have already started to gather the members since yesterday, but there are still some people outside. Most of them are in other floors, and we won't be able to summon them back in a short period of time. But I will have Brothers Walker stay here and continue to gather members. He will come here once a week, and he should be able to bring all the members who are willing to leave. As for those who are unwilling," Professor Shi Erfu said calmly, "I will make them willing." Asalia laughed dryly and did not say anything else. She was satisfied with the agreement she signed with the academy, and she could not wait to leave this damned dungeon. As for the unlucky members who were originally evil, she could only wish them good luck. Next, she asked Strategist to give the list of members to Professor Shi Erfu, and then she brought all the members to an open space for the professors to inspect. Excluding those who chose to leave and those who did not return, there were nearly 50 members left in the base, which was half of the Abyss organization. Not all of these monsters were good people, but they were basically harmless. With Professor Ka Zayer around, they could not lie at all. Once he found a monster with evil intentions, he could immediately find it. The entire inspection process lasted until midnight. Asalia passed down the contents of the agreement, and most of the monsters were very cooperative. When the inspection was over, all of the monsters had already carried their luggage and were ready to return to the surface. For them, this was something they had always yearned for. They were grateful for the tolerance and kindness of the Shang Malian Academy. Of course, all of this was based on the fact that they did not have much choice. The pressure of the academy professors was too strong. 2:00 in the morning. The professors brought nearly 50 monsters to the meeting room on the 99th floor. Then 2 professors opened the crystal door to the first floor. At 2:00 in the morning, there were basically no students in the meeting room on the first floor. The monsters went through the portal one by one, and gathered in the meeting room on the first floor. Professor Shi Erfu reminded them of the rules after leaving the dungeon, especially not to yell and shout. Then he led the monsters through the magic door and went to the surface. At this time, the night was dark, the stars were like fireflies, and the full moon illuminated the starry sky. When the monsters looked up, they could not help but howl, but the whole square was shrouded in silent spell in the next moment. Professor Shi Erfu sternly glared at the monster, and it whimpered like a puppy. But aside from this minor flaw, the monsters had indeed welcomed a new life. If the Shang Malian Academy was really as fair and tolerant as the legend said. Dake Dimeng, who had put on his backpack again, went through the magic door that was like a water curtain and stepped on the surface. He touched the fairy substitute that he kept close to his body, and while he was glad that he did not have to use it, he could not help but sigh about the experience of the past 2 days. Although he did not play a role from the beginning to the end, other than tying up Li Li, the experience of traveling with the professors would still have a great impact on his life. His vision became broader, and his future path became clearer. He also gained a lot of knowledge related to the dungeon adventure. He also clearly knew that there was a god's heart hidden in the dungeon. The beating sound of the huge heart was still echoing in his ears, making him more convinced of Eudora's prophecy. Whether the god's heart was sealed in the dungeon or generated by the dungeon itself, it was a sign of the recovery of the gods. The curtain was about to open, and it was far from being comparable to the Demon King. In the original game, these events were most likely just background, or they were left behind for the start of the second game. Dake didn't know the details, so he could only speculate. But he knew very well that reality was not a game. He couldn't hide in the academy for a lifetime like the characters in the game. Even if the sky fell, there were tall people to hold it up. But what if one day, the tall people couldn't hold it up? Dake couldn't really watch those tall people hold it up in front while he shrank behind. He couldn't do those things. When the monsters had completely calmed down, the professors took them away from the square at the entrance of the dungeon and prepared to go to the vast, dense forest. Dake didn't follow them. After he picked up Xiong Bao, he planned to return to the dormitory. If he couldn't enter the dormitory, he would go to the Magical Animal Society on the clock tower to stay for the night. It was only 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, and there was still a long weekend. "Do you want to go back to the dormitory?" Lily saw through his thoughts. He thought for a moment and said, "Can you help me?" Lily hugged his other arm and couldn't hide her smile, of course. Then she waved to the other professors, flapped her wings, and flew up. Without disturbing anyone, Lily took Dake through the wall and entered dormitory 301. "Sit for a while." The familiar environment made Dake relax quickly. He summoned Kettle Pot, put the fruit into its shell, then took out the teacup to wash it and prepared to make 2 cups of fresh juice. Of course, Lily didn't refuse. She sat on Dake's bed without any hesitation and said, "Do you have anything to ask?" Dake didn't have anything to ask, but since Lily said so, how could he not give her face? So Dake asked curiously, "Othbrook, I mean that shadow rat, how will the professors deal with it?" Lily blinked, then raised her hand and made a pulling gesture on her temple in front of him. Dake suddenly understood. "Pull out the memory?" Lily said in a light tone, "If it's Ka-Zayer, he'll probably do that. Although those monsters aren't the same as the original body of the memory, they do have the original body's memory. If the original body's memory isn't so wonderful, pulling it out is the best way. Of course, this will be very troublesome." In other words, if it wasn't Ka-Zayer, they might have used a simpler, more convenient, or even a more permanent method. Dake understood and didn't ask again. Lose the memory, or lose the life. If he had to choose between the two, he would have a hard time choosing. But from the standpoint of the academy, the professors couldn't allow a monster with the memory of the Plague Lord to live normally. Just washing away its memory was already the greatest kindness they could do. Dake handed Lily a cup of apple juice and asked again, "Actually, I'm very curious. What did you and Professor Ka-Zayer do to the Golden Mermaid?" "Aha." Lily took a sip of apple juice and said casually, "Actually, it's nothing. We just helped it shape a temporary personality, so it gained the sensitivity of a golem and temporarily recovered the ability to cry. After all, things like tears have to flow naturally to be effective. Physical tears can't be used." Dake recalled Professor Ka-Zayer's awkward expression and couldn't help but ask, "So, what kind of personality did Professor Ka-Zayer create for it?" Lily said with a trembling little finger, "Look at the Golden Mermaid. Doesn't it look like a little crying bag?" Dake touched his nose and said, "Indeed. Then it is." Lily said, "It looks like a little crybaby, so Ka-Zayer created a crybaby personality for it and made it mistakenly think that Ka-Zayer was a kind old father. Then, it witnessed its father's death in its mind." For materials like tears, their special power usually came from the power of the soul. Therefore, emotional guidance was very important. The monster boss in the dungeon had the body structure of all living creatures, but it didn't have a consciousness. Through research, Professor Ka-Zayer transplanted the virtual personality into the brain of the Golden Mermaid, but he didn't expect that the Golden Mermaid's self-awareness had already begun to develop. Thinking about it now, the Golden Mermaid Asaria Paetus's current personality might have been affected by the virtual personality and retained the memories of that experience. However, that memory might have brought it a deeper level of fear. It was already very restrained that it didn't call Professor Ka-Zayer Daddy on the spot. After knowing the truth, Dake couldn't help but open his mouth and say, "No wonder Professor Ka-Zayer didn't want to look at it directly. Okay, I should go." Lily drank the last mouthful of apple juice and licked the corner of her mouth. Dake took the cup from her hand and said, Go ahead, good night. Lily laughed and flew up. Good night, see you tomorrow. Dake waved his hand and said, See you tomorrow. Professor Lily went through the wall and silently flew out of the Noble Academy's tower. With her personality, she must have flown into the forest. Dake walked to the balcony and watched her fly away. He then returned to the room to summon Paradise and let the magician's secretary summon the magician fairies. He casually picked up a book and soaked it in the bathtub. There were originally a large number of powerful creatures living in the forest of the Shang-Malian Academy. Only 50 monster bosses living in the forest were far from enough to change the ecology of the forest. It was just that finding a suitable place to live in the forest and building a perfect facility wasn't something that could be done overnight. However, in the long run, these monsters would be assimilated into the Shang-Malian Academy sooner or later. If all went well, they might be able to build a special place that was different from the Traveler's Street. Dake planned to wait until the monsters settled down before finding a chance to go in and take a look. Those monster bosses were still very attractive to him. The night passed. After Dake woke up, he took out his notebook and slowly recalled the experiences of the past 2 days. He then slowly pondered over it and gradually sorted out his thoughts. He removed himself from the things that were beyond his ability and temporarily returned to the normal path of learning. After that, he took out the 3,000 items, 8,000 crafting methods, and began to search for the bronze mirror. There weren't many items left that were supposed to be made into item cards. Other than the clown mask, there was the bronze mirror. Other than that, items like the gravity boots might not have much use in a magic duel, but they could still be used for daily training. However, the priority of the bronze mirror was obviously higher. The 3,000 items, 8,000 crafting methods, didn't have an item similar to the bronze mirror. However, Dake diverged his thoughts and found the method to make the cursed mask and the mirror of wisdom. The cursed mask was a mask with a cursed effect. It could make the person who wore the mask lose their rationality and gradually petrify in a frenzy. The mirror of wisdom was a mirror that was good at lying. It was good at deceiving the holder, letting the holder see the beauty of himself and give the holder praise according to his heart. It made the holder indulge in a false perfection and eventually self-destruct. After careful consideration, Dake decided to try to combine the refining methods of these 2 items and use it on the bronze mirror. Anyway, he wasn't afraid of failure. Success was a big gain. Everything was for improvement. However, the process of combining the 2 methods into one was much more difficult than he imagined. From morning to afternoon, except for the occasional distraction, he was carefully studying, but the progress was very slow. Near evening, in order to prevent the lack of materials after the experiment began, Dake had to go to Traveler's Street to buy some materials that might be needed. Recently, his expenses were getting bigger and bigger, and his credit reserve was decreasing visibly. Finally, he felt a sense of crisis. After he returned and sat down again, he picked up the materials again. It was as though he had suddenly been enlightened. Flashes of inspiration kept flashing, and he had advanced more than half of his progress in one breath. When Aurora knocked on the door and entered, he could almost see the end. "Are you studying the refining of item cards again?" Aurora asked curiously as she put the all-nourishing soup on the table. Dake put down his pen and sighed. "If I don't study something, it's like I'm missing something. I always want to make the best use of it." Aurora said with a smile, "Then let's eat something first before continuing the research." "When did you get back?" 2 in the morning, Dake said. Aurora couldn't hold back her curiosity. "Didn't you pass the curfew? How did you get in?" Dake said with a smile, "The curfew isn't for professors." "Oh." Aurora thought about it and said, "Let me guess. It was Professor Li, wasn't it?" "You guessed it right away." Dake picked up the bowl, filled it with soup, and drank it. His whole body felt comfortable. When Aurora saw how comfortable he looked, she felt much better too. She said, "You went into the dungeon with the professors this time, didn't you?" Dake raised his head a little and asked curiously, "How did you know?" "I don't think I told you." Aurora covered her mouth and laughed softly. Someone saw you. Do you know how much attention you're getting? Dake thought back and seemed to have met a 3-person team. He couldn't help but smile helplessly. Do you know the mirror of wisdom? You're like my mirror of wisdom. 22 of 127. My family suddenly came over with a matchmaking number. In the end, they got the number and name wrong. In short, it was quite troublesome and wasted a lot of time. But I still wrote 10,000. Keep it up. Begging for monthly votes. Begging for razor blades. Chapter 619. 2 days later, in the evening. Dake finally came up with a feasible idea based on the refining method of the Cursed Mask and the Mirror of Wisdom. Even though he could not make a mistake because he only had one bronze mirror, he had made a simulation based on various data and confirmed that there were no mistakes. After everything was ready, he chose to conduct the experiment on Tuesday night. The bronze mirror was essentially a replica of the Medusa's mirror. Medusa was a snake-haired banshee. Her upper body was human and her lower body was a snake. Every strand of her hair was a slender snake. That was why she was called a snake-haired banshee. According to legend, Medusa was born with the ability to petrify. No matter who it was, they would be petrified as long as they looked into her eyes. Another monster with similar abilities was the cockatrice, which was commonly seen in the underground city. The cockatrice's eyes could shoot out gray petrification rays and turn the target into stone. Remember the website, Vipkanshu. VIP. However, the petrification abilities of the cockatrice and Medusa were worlds apart. Their powers were not on the same level at all. As long as the enchanters were prepared beforehand, they could use cloth to block the petrification rays and avoid being petrified by the cockatrice. Even if they were petrified accidentally, they could use the lime toad saliva or the petrification removal potion to remove the petrification from the cockatrice. The concoction of the anti-petrification potion was not difficult. The core ingredient, the snake tongue flower, could be found around the Medusa statue on the 10th floor of the dungeon. Dake had made many petrification removal potions in advance to test the bronze mirror's petrification ability. Medusa's petrification was almost impossible to remove. Of course, the bronze mirror was only a replica. After testing, its petrification ability was only slightly stronger than the cockatrice's. It could also be removed with the petrification removal potion. Dake's goal was to further enhance the bronze mirror's petrification ability in the process of refining it into an item card. Therefore, he referred to the refining method of the Cursed Mask and prepared to add 3 points of greed during the refining process. One could not catch a wolf without risking one's child. He could not be too stingy. Greed symbol was Saturn, and its main attributes were rock and ground. At least in terms of attributes, it was compatible with petrification. However, whether or not it was truly useful would have to wait until the end of the experiment to find out. He used the dark spirit art to quickly calm himself down, and then focused on the experiment. The softener of the bronze mirror was based on the softener of the Mirror of Wisdom. The ink used to write the magical language was the reference for the cursed mask. The most important part, the magic guide language, was the combination of the two items and the activation incantation of the bronze mirror. Claire had used that line of incantation to activate the bronze mirror and make it show the power of petrification. After that, Dake recorded the activation incantation, and now it was useful. With softener, ink, and magic language, the experiment was on the right track. After a full 3 hours, Doc finally pushed the entire experiment to the stage of smelting materials. As he added the supplementary materials, he observed the reaction of the number 4 refining formation. In order to ensure that the bronze mirror's petrification ability was not reduced, Dake used a large number of cockatrices for the supplementary materials and focused on the cursed mask as refining method. The reaction of the refining formation was quite stable, and the materials were integrated into the light formation bit by bit. After that, Dake finally put the softened bronze mirror into the refining formation. In fact, this was the most important step. Whether the refining idea was correct or not depended on whether the refining formation could successfully refine the bronze mirror. Fortunately, His learning and experiments during this period of time were effective, and the final result did not deviate too much from his original plan. After he hurriedly added the 2 supplementary materials, he finally successfully refined the bronze mirror. During the process, he did put in 3 points of greed. 3 points of greed were enough to make the greed emblem appear. However, with the addition of greed, the upper limit of the refining formation suddenly increased. Because it was only a very small amount, he did not choose to add the 4th point of greed. Instead, he chose some supplementary materials to fill it up, and finally, the refining formation was almost saturated. After gaining even more refining experience, Jihong finally completed the final refining. When the internal reaction of the magic card finally stopped, Dake finally let out a sigh of relief. He used a pair of tweezers to pick it out of the gray viscous liquid and put it under the tap to wash it. The water rushed down with a sound of "hua la la." The magic card gradually revealed its true appearance. Dake saw the mirror image that appeared on the card at a glance. The original, bronze mirror, was a circular mirror, and the bronze frame that wrapped the mirror was engraved with very complicated and beautiful flower decorations. But this magic card that had just been refined had 4 snakes crawling on top of its frame. The 4 slender bronze snakes formed a new flower decoration, and it added a mysterious and strange aura to the mirror. However, after Dake saw the 4 snakes, he was delighted. He immediately realized that this bronze mirror was closer to the Medusa's mirror, after being refined into an item card. As a replica, the more similar it was, the better. Phew! The little devil beast suddenly flew down from the bird's stand and stopped on his shoulder, looking at the item card curiously. Did it succeed? It tilted its head and asked. In order to refine this item card, the little devil beast had put in a lot of effort, so it was especially concerned. Dake took a deep breath and said, "I'll only know after I check it out." Then, he used his fingers to grab the magic card and infused it with magic to get the initial feedback. Card name, Bronze Snake Mirror. Type, Item Card. Effect 1, Spirit +3, Rationality -3. Effect 2, comes with the ultimate skill, Bronze Snake. Effect 3, Ultimate Skill, Petrifying Gaze. 3 effects, and 2 of them are ultimate skills. Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he couldn't help but take a closer look, but then he frowned. After the bronze mirror was refined into an item card, it became the Bronze Snake Mirror. It had a total of 3 effects. However, the first effect was half positive and half negative. Spirit +3 not only gave the wielder an additional boost to spirit, but it also made the wielder more spirited and emotional. Although this effect wasn't very useful in a magic duel, it was useful for a magus. However, the second half of the first effect was Rationality -3. Rationality -3. The negative effect of the Bronze Snake Lens was actually within his expectations. After all, whether it was the Cursed Mask or the Mirror of Wisdom, both were not friendly to the holder. Spirit +3 and Rationality -3 seemed contradictory, but in fact, there was no conflict. Losing one's rationality in excitement meant becoming chaotic. This was in line with the Cursed Mask's effect. Moreover, after the holder became chaotic, it was easier for the holder to be deceived by the mirror, until they became lost. This was in line with the Mirror of Wisdom. However, if this was the only side effect, Dake wasn't worried. He pondered for a moment, and then looked at the last 2 effects. First was the Effect 2. This, Bronze Snake Lens, came with 2 sure kill skills, which were relatively rare among item cards. And one of these 2 ultimate skills was the Bronze Snake. From the name of the ultimate skill, it should be a skill to summon a snake. However, after Dake injected more magic to check, he found that this wasn't the case. Bronze Snake. A bronze snake is sleeping in the Bronze Snake Mirror. Settled desire will awaken the bronze snake from its sleep, and those with weak willpower will be lost in the whispers of the bronze snake. The effect of the Mirror of Wisdom seemed to have been perfectly transferred to the Bronze Snake Mirror. Dake didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He shook the magic card, and suddenly his heart skipped a beat. The whispers of the bronze snake. Could it be that not only the holder can hear it? From the description, this idea was very possible. If this was the case, then the bronze snake's ultimate skill could be used. Normal magic elves might not be confused by the bronze snake's whispers. After all, they didn't have the ability to think. However, if this ultimate skill was used on intelligent beings, it might be able to subtly make them lose themselves. Thinking of this, Dake couldn't wait to summon the bronze snake mirror and try it out. But he held back. Then he continued to look at the last effect 3. This effect 3 came with the ultimate skill, Petrifying Gaze. It was the easiest skill to understand among the 3 effects. Dake looked at it. Petrifying Gaze. The 4 snakes on the frame of the bronze snake mirror will come to life after the petrifying gaze is activated, and those who are stared at by them will be turned into stone. As for the extent of the petrifying gaze's petrification effect, he would have to experiment to find out. Dake took a light breath and said, "It seems like the refining is successful. Wait for me to summon it." In the name of Dake Dimeng, I summoned the bronze snake mirror. As soon as the summoning ended, a bronze mirror with 4 small snakes crawling on it appeared in front of Dake. He reached out and grasped it. He could feel his spirit, which was originally dispirited due to the long period of experimenting, rising slightly. As for the little bit of rationality that was removed, it was almost negligible to him, who was constantly fighting against the great sin. As long as it wasn't a negative effect like greed +3, it wouldn't affect him. He picked up the mirror and looked at it carefully, then stared at the bronze snake mirror surface. Suddenly, the surface of the mirror rippled like the surface of a water surface. A large snake with bronze scales slowly opened its inverted snake eyes in the mirror world. Hiss, a faint whisper suddenly entered his ears. Dake looked around and noticed that the magic elves who had been watching him all frowned at the same time. He immediately realized that the bronze snake's whispers were wide range. As for how wide its range could be, at least none of the magic elves in the room were immune. Dake stared at the bronze snake's reflection in the mirror and suddenly asked, "Bronze snake? Bronze snake, bronze snake, who is the most handsome person in the world?" It's you. After answering his own question, Dake smiled and was about to try to make the bronze snake disappear. Hiss, all of a sudden, he thought of a possibility. If I can master this bronze snake mirror to the point where I can control the bronze snake, can I use this bronze snake to send messages over a wide range? He didn't need to open his mouth or speak. His message was conveyed through the bronze snake to the ears of everyone around him. This kind of long-distance communication ability was actually very useful. After this, I have to give it a try. Dake couldn't help but decide. When he no longer looked at the bronze snake mirror with a lustful gaze, the bronze snake gradually closed its eyes and fell into a deep sleep again. After Dake mastered the technique to make it disappear, he took out a row of anti-petrification potions and placed them on the table. Then, he let the little fiend fly in front of him. Then, he injected magic and activated the bronze snake mirror's ultimate skill, Petrification Gaze. In the next second, the 4 little snakes on the mirror frame opened their snake eyes at the same time and stared at the little fiend in front of them. The little fiend was already mentally prepared and immediately used its wings to cover its body. However, when the Petrification Gaze's light petrified its wings, it also petrified its body at the same time. It was obvious that this level of protection was completely useless. There was still cloth hanging on one of its wings, but this time, it still didn't have the effect of blocking. After it had completely turned into a stone statue, Dake picked up a anti-petrification potion and sprinkled it on its body. However, the little fiend's petrified shell only showed signs of melting. No amount of anti-petrification potion could remove the petrification. As usual, Dake carried out a resistance test on the petrified little fiend. The result was that after it turned into stone, the little fiend's defense had increased significantly. According to the records, monsters called gargoyles would petrify themselves to resist attacks. The bronze snake mirror's petrification gaze seemed to be able to be used in this way. After this, Dake didn't immediately remove the summon to get the little fiend out of the petrification state. He calculated the time and waited patiently. After about 5 minutes, the petrification state on the little fiend's body was automatically removed. The petrification gaze's cooldown was a full hour. Obviously, the bronze snake mirror's petrification gaze is closer to the Medusa's petrification ability in all aspects and is different from the cockatrice's petrification ability. In terms of petrification strength, there is also an obvious increase. Normal, anti-petrification potions can no longer remove it immediately. As for the duration of the petrification state, it has been shortened to 5 minutes. This is in line with the phenomenon that usually occurs when an item is turned into an item card. All in all, the bronze snake mirror has been greatly strengthened and has more potential to be developed. Dake wrote in his notebook. The refinement this time was undoubtedly very successful. Item cards like this didn't have too many equipment restrictions. Basically, any magic elf that could be carried could be equipped. The high-intensity petrification effect would definitely allow it to shine in a magic duel. Then, the only item left to be refined into an item card is the clown mask. Dake couldn't help but ponder. In his prediction, the clown mask, after being refined into an item card, would have a special ability that could be forcefully equipped on the opponent. This would turn it into a control-type magic card like the bronze snake mirror. The research on the refinement method of the cursed mask also gave him a clue on how to refine the clown mask. In short, as long as he could research the refinement method of the clown mask before October, he would be able to make it in time for the Golden Cup. It wasn't a big problem. It was a pity that he wouldn't be able to make it in time for this year's Halloween event. Although there was still half a month before Halloween, the festive atmosphere had already spread. The first-year students who had never celebrated Halloween after the academy, the senior students, who were short on credits, were eyeing the Halloween event covetously to harvest credits. The men and women who were spying on the masquerade party, they had already started preparing. However, on this year's Halloween, there was no church, no moon goddess, and no Princess Eliza. Even Professor Ka-Zayer wasn't there. Dake only realized that Ka-Zayer didn't have pumpkin sauce on him when he bumped into him in the castle. This was completely impossible for Professor Ka-Zayer, who had started preparing for the event a month earlier than last year. In summary, Dake could only conclude that the person in charge of this year's Halloween event had been changed. Under normal circumstances, even if the person in charge was changed, with Professor Ka-Zayer's personality, he would most likely help out. However, the huge heart in the underground city had probably completely absorbed his attention. Without Professor Ka-Zayer's Halloween event, Dake didn't know why, but he suddenly had a very ominous premonition. He shook his head violently and forcibly shook off this feeling. Most of the professors in the academy were still reliable, so there wouldn't be too big of a loophole. This year's Halloween would definitely be a safe and joyful one. Instead of thinking about this, it was better to think about what to wear at the masquerade party. It couldn't be the Prince of Night costume that he wore last year, right? Dake couldn't help but ponder. Even if this week's weekend was included, there were only 2 weekends left before Halloween. If he didn't think about it quickly, he would have to wear the Prince of Night costume again. With this in mind, Dake walked onto the duel stage. Today was October 18th, Friday. Silver Cup. Continue. Good morning, it's another day of hard work. Monthly votes. Blades. Chapter 620. The autumn sun shone down diagonally, and the duel stage was dyed with a layer of bright orange. The cheers of the audience were still like a tidal wave, and the students were whispering in the ring. On the red platform, Dake Dim-Eng was putting the adjusted cards into the card slot. The bright sun shone on his face, and his green eyes were like amber. The Silver Cup required the contestants to participate in at least 10 matches. This was also Professor Cheong-Si's requirement for the students. Therefore, even if Dake didn't want to participate in the quarterfinals, he had to follow Professor Cheong-Si's request and complete the 10 matches. In fact, he had already received the new schedule on Tuesday. Perhaps it was because he had applied for a postponement last week, so the duel club had compressed 2 weeks of matches into one. Therefore, He needed to complete the remaining 5 points competition matches this weekend. To him, this was not a difficult task. The matches were divided into 3 days, and the interval between each match was more than an hour. It was a friendly arrangement. After Dake activated the card table, he looked up at the opposite platform. Remember, https://m Vipkanchu. VIP on the blue platform was Rentgen from the House of Nobles. In other words, this was an internal fight in the House of Nobles. Doc and Rentgen had a good relationship, at least a relationship where they could exchange a few words. However, he didn't pay much attention to Rentgen's results. His impression was that she was above average. In short, he could relax a little in this duel, but he couldn't be too careless. "Hey, Dake." Rentgen saw Dake look up and quickly greeted him. He looked a little nervous, and there were even beads of sweat on his freckled nose. His good friend, Civet, was cheering for him loudly in the ring of spectators, which made him even more nervous. Dake looked at Rentgen and asked, "What's wrong, Rentgen?" Rentgen opened her mouth and said, "That. Nothing. Let's start the duel." Dake nodded and smiled. "Then let's start." Rentgen wanted to tell Dake to go easy on him, at least to save him some face, but she didn't do so in the end. As a member of the House of Nobles, if he showed weakness at this time, he would be looked down upon. He took a deep breath and decided to go all out. No matter what the final result was, he could not make a fool of himself. The second-year students of the aristocratic academy sat in the ring and watched the duel with relaxed expressions. Since it was a civil war between the aristocrats, there was no conflict between factions. Moreover, they couldn't figure out where Dake would lose. The highlight of this duel was probably how long Dake's opponent could last. Even Shivet, who was cheering with all his might, was probably thinking the same thing. Anna and Luo C were even fighting with each other. Beep. Amidst such a warm atmosphere, the referee suddenly blew the whistle. Both players entered the preparation stage. Then, the cards on the table began to automatically shuffle. Then, the 30-second countdown of the preparation stage appeared in the projection above the venue. Both contestants drew their cards at the same time. Without saying much, Doc quickly took out the 5 magic cards and placed them in his left hand. He quickly unfolded them. Then, he lowered his head slightly and looked at the cards in his hand. War Horn, Trash Slime, Greed 3, Lion Beast, Little Snorlax. Due to the strong protest of the magic elves, Dake did not use Bliss or Pride as the theme to build the deck this time. He put most of the magic elves into the deck. Together with the newly crafted item cards, he had a total of 40 magic cards. However, this did not mean that this set of 40 cards would be weaker than a set of 20 cards. The number of magic cards in the deck was less, and the biggest advantage was that it could reduce the number of accidents. However, at the same time, it would also weaken the fault tolerance. Once the deck was targeted, it would be impossible to turn the tables. In fact, 20 magic cards were indeed too few. It made sense for a regular magic duel to use 40 magic cards. Of course, in this duel, there was not much difference between 20 cards and 40 cards. Dake looked at the magic cards in his hand, and a variety of battle strategies immediately appeared in his mind. "I didn't expect to get this War Horn in the first round." Dake smiled. "Let's not look at this item card first. Among the 5 cards in my hand, there are 2 3-star magic elves that can be summoned at the start. Whether it's Trash Slime or Little Snorlax, I can use Greed 3 to evolve them. Currently, there are 2 routes. One is to summon Little Snorlax, and use Greed 3 to evolve it into Snorlax. The other way is to summon a Trash Slime, then use Greed 3 to evolve it into a Greed Slime 2. Then, use Divide and Succeed to create a sacrifice to summon a Lion Beast." Dake thought for a while and made his choice. The 30-second countdown passed in a flash. The 2 contestants began to cast their usual summoning spells at the same time. "In the name of Dake Dimeng, I summon Trash Slime by magic." Although the summoning of Snorlax was faster and more direct, Dake still chose to summon Trash Slime at the start. The main reason was that his opponent's usual summoning speed was indeed not fast enough. He did not have to worry that he would be killed instantly if he summoned Trash Slime at the start. Although Snorlax was powerful enough, its sure kill skill was completely of the ground type. Heavy Stomp and Earthquake could not cause any damage to aerial units. Moreover, Snorlax's movement speed was really slow. As a parent, Dake also needed to pay attention to the mental health of the magic elves. Trash Slime needed a stage to prove itself more than little Snorlax. He needed to build up its confidence. This duel was just right. As expected. When Dake completed his summoning, Rentgen was still trying hard to cast her usual summoning spell. Even when Dake began to cast his second summoning spell, Rentgen was still trying hard. There was a relatively big gap between the two in terms of magic technology. In fact, it was difficult to rely on magic cards or strategies to make up for the gap. In the summoning area of the red team, after Trash Slime appeared in the summoning light, it instantly opened its eyes wide and looked around. It then immediately realized that it was the first to be summoned by the red team. For it, this was completely an exception. It almost thought that its master's brain was damaged. However, when Greed 3's light shone down from above, its heart calmed down. At this time, there were already magic elves appearing in the summoning area of the blue team. Trash Slime felt the power of greed continuously pouring into its body, and its inner confidence was also rising. Finally, it evolved into a second-tier magic elf in the blue-purple light, Greed Slime 2. Card name, Greed Slime 2. Type, Elf card. Race, Elemental. Attribute, Grass. Magic power, 3000. Attack, 0. Defense, 2000. Ultimate skill, Greed Instinct, Divide and Conquer, Photosynthesis. Then, according to the established strategy, it turned around and swallowed the red magic ball into its body. A full 2000 points of defense was enough to help it withstand most of the damage. At least, it would be difficult for the first-tier magic elf summoned by Rentgen to break through its defense. Greed Slime, Divide and Conquer, 5. On the red team's platform, Dake said calmly after putting down Greed 3's magic card. Gurgle, Greed Slime 2, was a little excited. It then took a deep breath, causing its already large body to become even larger until a larger space appeared in its body. Then, 2 Greed Slime Eye and 1 Trash Slime split out from its body and rolled around in the space. After seeing this scene, Dake couldn't help but smile. Directly splitting 1 and 2 stars in the body was also one of the established strategies. It seemed that Greed Slime 2 executed it well. After that, when the cooldown of the normal summoning spell was over, he began to chant the sacrificial summoning spell. During this process, Rentgen, who was on the blue team's platform, couldn't just stand there and wait. After summoning the first magic elf, she immediately gave the order to attack. The magic elf that appeared in the blue team's summoning area was like a leopard, with a sharp horn shaped like lightning on its head. Its name was Thunder Leopard, and it was Rentgen's proudest 3-star magic elf. Card name, Thunder Leopard. Type, Elf card. Level, ****. Race, Bird Beast. Attribute, Lightning. Magic, 1500. Attack, 1400. Defense, 1200. Ultimate skill, Lightning Speed, Lightning Pulse. Although Thunder Leopard's attack and defense weren't at the pinnacle of 3 stars, it was full of magic, and its ultimate skill was very practical. Rentgen took a deep breath and unleashed her aura. Thunder Leopard, use Lightning Speed to charge. After hearing its master's order, Thunder Leopard charged without hesitation. Blue electric currents appeared on its 4 limbs, and its muscle strength was stimulated, causing its speed to soar in an instant. It crossed the 120-meter field in the blink of an eye. Rentgen saw the opportunity and suddenly shouted, "Lightning Pulse!" Thunder Leopard approached Greedy Slime 2, a few meters away. It lowered its head and aimed its sharp horn at Greedy Slime 2. Then, amidst the crackling sounds, A pulse of concentrated electric current was suddenly launched from the sharp horn. Thunder Leopard didn't slow down at all, and its sharp horn fiercely stabbed into Greedy Slime to his body. Boom! Greedy Slime, too, took the full damage from Lightning Pulse, and because of Divide Works, it consumed 1,000 points of magic, and it didn't decrease at all. On the platform, Rentgen's eyes widened. Lightning Pulse's power wasn't weak, and it could even be said to be very strong. However, Greedy Slime, too, was a grass-type monster, even though it was hard to tell from its appearance. Grass-type elves had a relatively strong immunity against Thunder-type ultimate skills. In addition to Greedy Slime 2's 2,000 points of defense, this powerful ultimate skill couldn't break through its defense. In the next moment, Thunder Leopard, which had plunged into Greedy Slime 2's body, was actually rebounded after all the impact was absorbed. Although this attack was accompanied by the increase in strength from the acceleration, it still couldn't break through its defense. Greedy Slime 2's body structure allowed it to be immune to some physical attacks. Thunder Leopard couldn't cause any damage to it at all. In the name of Dake Dim-eng, 2 Greedy Slime Eye and 1 Trash Slime are offered as sacrifices to summon Lion Beast. After the chanting of the sacrificial summoning spell was completed, Dake slightly raised the Lion Beast magic card in his hand. From Greedy Slime to his body, 3 rays of white light shot out at the same time, intersecting with the white light from the Lion Beast card in the air. A huge sacrificial summoning circle appeared in everyone's eyes. Roar! The 5-star magic fairy, Lion Beast, slowly walked out from the sacrificial summoning circle. Lion Beast, I'll leave the rest to you. After Dake finished speaking, he didn't stop. Instead, he waited for the cooldown of the summoning spell to be over and continued to summon the last magic fairy, Snorlax. The purpose of summoning Snorlax wasn't to be cautious, but to let it out for some fresh air. Ka-Meng. After Snorlax was summoned, it was obviously very happy. However, when it opened its eyes, it saw that Lion Beast was punching a leopard that was surrounded by lightning. Beast King Punch. The energy wave in the shape of a lion shattered Thunder Leopard's punch. Snorlax looked at the empty field opposite it and couldn't help but tilt its head and sit on the ground. It was already giving Dake a lot of face by not falling asleep on the spot. Next, let's try Warhorn. Dake looked at the last card in his hand and couldn't help but smile. However, Rentgen on the opposite side couldn't smile at all. He was now standing on the blue team's platform and felt like he was in jail. Dake had already sacrificed a second-tier magic fairy, but he hadn't even summoned his second magic fairy yet. After Thunder Leopard was killed by Lion Beast, his blue magic crystal ball on the field was no longer guarded. When he felt that something was wrong and wanted to control the magic crystal ball to fly and dodge, he suddenly felt another magic power acting on the blue magic crystal ball. There was no more suspense in the duel after that. Dake released his magic power and forced the blue magic crystal ball to the ground. Rentgen obviously had a great distance advantage in controlling the magic crystal ball, but she was still successfully suppressed by Dake. Dake didn't even summon Warhorn, and the life enchantment on the blue magic crystal ball was shattered by Lion Beast's 2 punches. The blue team's contestant, Rentgen, had no ability to resist at all. Good morning, today is also a day of all-nighters. Please guarantee the minimum monthly votes. Please guarantee the minimum blades. Chapter 621. Before the applause stopped, it started again. Greedy Slime 2 shook twice as if it wasn't satisfied yet. Then, it spat out the red cube ball. Then, it hopped to the side of Snorlax, and with a forceful bounce, it landed on Snorlax's belly. Ouch! Wheeze! Snorlax continued to sleep on its belly. Greedy Slime 2 pouted its mouth. Damn it! On the red platform, Dake Diming's elfin smiled. Then, it picked up the magic cards and collected them one by one. Then, it packed up the cards and walked down the platform. Although Rentgen's courage was commendable, she still needed to work harder. Website: https://m. Vipkanchu. VIP. After he walked out of the platform, he went to Anna and Luo and sat down to watch the duel with them. Of course, other than the duel of the Silver Cup, there were other duels of higher grades going on at the same time in the stadium. While he was watching the duels, he continued to learn the knowledge of making item cards. Switching between the two could effectively stop the growth of greedy. During this period, Anna and Luo both had their duels, and they both won. Just like how Dake had been learning and making new magic cards, they did not stop improving. Whether it was Anna or Luo, both of them were trying their best to make up for the shortcomings of their cards. 2 hours later, Dake put down his book and said to Anna, "It's my turn again." Anna bit her pen and stared at the math homework on her knees. She muttered without looking up, "Go, go." Dake looked at her sad face and shook his head. Then, he walked to the contestants' passage alone. This was his second duel today. The other 3 duels would be held tomorrow and the day after. As he rose, he saw that Piton Kellogg, who was beside Dolan, had also risen. "Hey, Pitan," Dake greeted. The little fatty Pitan waved his hand at Doran and quickly walked to Dake's side. He laughed softly. "Heh, Dake, I won't be as easy to deal with as Rentgen." Dake asked curiously, "A secret weapon?" Pitan patted his belly and smiled mysteriously. "Just you wait and see." After the 2 of them entered the contestant passage, they waited for a while before arriving at the duel arena under the guidance of the staff. After they shook hands in the middle, they walked back to back toward the contestant stands on both sides. Dake was still on the red side, while Pitan was on the blue side. After getting on the contestant platform, Dake inserted the card deck into the card slot and activated the card table. Then, he heard cheers coming from outside. He turned his head slightly and saw Dolan waving 2 flags with the names Dake Dimming and Piton Kellogg on them. He couldn't help but laugh. No wonder he's young. He's full of energy. He shook his head and turned to the front. Suddenly he looked up and said, "Pitan, let me see your secret weapon." Pitan also activated the card table and said, "Don't be too surprised in a moment." After he finished speaking, he glanced at the audience outside the arena. His heart skipped a beat. He had always heard that those in the spinach industry would bet on the number of rounds of a duel if there was no suspense in the outcome. For example, in Dake's duel with Rentgen, there must have been a lot of people who had done their research and bet on 1 or 3 rounds. Then, they got a lot of money. In this duel, he guessed that he would receive the same treatment as Rentgen. But today, Pitan, was going to let those spinach people know what it meant to pay back. Beep! With the referee's whistle, the duel finally entered the preparation stage. Then, behind the preparation stage, a 30's countdown appeared. The players on both sides looked serious and immediately focused their attention on the duel. When all 5 cards were in their hands, they quickly thought of a strategy. Dake looked at his cards. Fruit Eating Bug, Meow Meow, Greed 3, Bliss 3, Month, Sickle Cut Dagger, 2 Magic Elf cards, 2 Great Sin cards, and 1 Equipment card. There's no problem with a combination. Since the opponent is Pitan, there's not much difference between summoning the Fruit Eating Bug or summoning Meow Meow. Thinking about how Trash Slime was the starter in the last duel, it was not good to favor one and discriminate against the other. After the 30-second countdown ended, Dake immediately started summoning. In the name of Dake Dimming, it's decided that it's you, Fruit Eating Bug. 3 seconds later, a bright red apple fell from the sky and landed on top of the red magic ball. Dake's summoning of a 1-star magic elf in the last duel was already shocking enough. The audience did not expect him to do so in this duel. Moreover, they had never seen a Fruit Eating Bug before and had no understanding of this 1-star magic elf. Hence, their minds were full of question marks. But on the blue team platform, Piston did not relax in the slightest. He knew very well that Doc was not the kind of person who would shoot without thinking. Even if the magic elf he summoned was a harmless baby, it could turn into a terrifying evil dragon in the next moment. Hence, he gave it his all. When Dake's normal summoning had just finished its cooldown, Pitan finally completed his summoning. In the name of Piton Kellogg, I summon Spiral Steel Snake. Hiss! A dazzling silver light shot out from the magic elf card. A large snake with a layer of silver carapace on its back appeared in the light of the summoning. Pitten's magic elf was quite rare, but as a popular magic elf among the 3-star magic elves, it was easily recognizable. The spiral steel snake's silver carapace could be hard or soft. When it was hard, it was incomparably hard. When it was soft, it was like a normal snake skin that could be rolled around at will. This was also the reason for its name. Card name, Spiral Steel Snake. Type, Elf Card. Level, *****. Race, Reptile. Attribute, Steel. Magic Power, 1400. Attack, 500. Defense, 1600. Ultimate Skill, Spiral Steel. Spiral Steel was the most basic ultimate skill of the Spiral Steel Snake. After Pittan successfully summoned it, he immediately shouted, "Spiral Steel Snake, roll up!" The large snake with the silver carapace only paused for a moment, then immediately followed his command and coiled around the blue magic elf ball behind it. In the blink of an eye, it coiled around the blue magic elf ball into a huge ball. The silver carapace faced outwards, and at that moment, it lit up with a bright silver light. The steel elemental energy surged wildly, turning the soft carapace into hard steel, and its defense skyrocketed. However, when the ultimate skill of the Spiral Steel Snake was completed, Dake had also completed his second summoning. The light of Greed 3 shone once again. The fruit-gnawing worm, which was curled up in the apple shell, faced the blue-purple light and began to evolve. This was the first time it stepped onto the stage of a duel, and its heart was filled with the desire to perform and win. That desire turned into greed, causing it to lean towards the offensive, apple-wrapped dragon, between the two forms of evolution. Figure, card name, apple-wrapped dragon. Type, elf card. Level, *****. Race, dragon. Attribute, grass/dragon. Magic power, 1600. Attack, 2000. Defense, 1000. Ultimate skill, vitality, gravitation, dragon's dive, substitute. The apple-wrapped dragon spread its wings and flew into the sky. Although it was still only the size of an apple, the aura it emitted was completely different. Dake looked up at the Spiral Steel Snake in the blue summoning area and asked in surprise, "Is this your strategy?" Pittan glanced at the magic elf in the red summoning area that he had never seen before and braced himself to say, "This is just the beginning." Roar! Suddenly, a sharp dragon's roar sounded from below. The apple-wrapped dragon's body lit up with a purple light that symbolized greed. Dake tapped on the magic card and immediately noticed that the apple-wrapped dragon was in the vitality state. The magic elf that had the ultimate skill vitality would have its attack power increase by 1.5 times when it was excited, but too much excitement would cause it to miss. As if sensing the apple-wrapped dragon's excitement, Dake's mood also rose slightly. In that case, apple-wrapped dragon, begin your performance, dragon's dive. The petite grass dragon soared into the sky amidst the dragon's roar, and then swooped down from the sky at lightning speed like a goshawk hunting a rabbit. In that instant, its body emitted a terrifying murderous aura. The Spiral Steel Snake, that had curled up into a steel ball, trembled under the stimulation of the murderous aura. On the blue platform, Pitten's scalp was also numb. He gripped the second magic card tightly and immediately began to chant. In the Spiral Steel Snake's spiral steel state, its defense increased by 0.5 times, reaching 2,400 points. But when apple-wrapped dragon swooped down, its momentum that seemed to be able to tear through everything made him panic. He had already bragged. If he were to be killed in a single round like Rentgen, wouldn't he lose all face? Pittan broke through his limits in the midst of his high tension, further reducing the duration of his normal summoning spell. But before that, the apple-wrapped dragon had already pierced through the Spiral Steel Snake's steel shell. Boom! The Spiral Steel Snake's steel shell cracked open layer by layer, revealing the bright red flesh within. The Spiral Steel Snake let out a shrill cry of fear, struggling at death's door with its last bit of magic power left. But when the apple-wrapped dragon wanted to continue after that attack, a beam of white light suddenly fell from above its head. When the white light disappeared, the spiral steel snake's body had an additional layer of hard, but also extremely heavy steel shell. Its already exaggerated defensive power instantly increased by another step. Just in time. Pitan, who was on the blue team's platform, took a deep breath. What was equipped on the spiral steel snake was not an equipment or item, but a magic elf called Steel Shell Beast. Card name, Steel Shell Beast. Type, Elf card, level, race, elemental, attribute, steel, magic power, 800, attack, 0, defense, 1000, ultimate skill, Steel Shell Parasite. He had placed a large number of defensive magic cards in the 20-card deck, and this Steel Shell Beast was one of them. Steel Shell Beast could only parasitize magic elves with steel attributes and a shell. Although it would cause the host's movement speed to plummet, it could increase its defense by 500 points. Moreover, the Steel Shell Beast's remaining magic power after casting Steel Shell Parasite would also stack together with the fusion of the two magic elves. The Spiral Steel Snake could be said to be ruthless. After parasitizing the Steel Shell Beast, the Spiral Steel Snake's defense should be able to reach 2,900 points. Even a second-tier magic elf would find it difficult to break through its defense. If it can hold on, I still have a defense spell in my hand that can continue to stack its defense. If it can hold on until the next round, I'll draw. Just as Pitan was counting down the cooldown of his summoning, the apple-wrapped dragon flapped its wings fiercely after casting Dragon's Dive, and continued to slash. The layer of thick steel shell that had been stirred up was viciously torn apart. Piston was dumbfounded. Even the steel shell could not defend against it. This meant that the apple-wrapped dragon's normal attack had exceeded 2,900 points. This ordinary-looking little dragon was actually so terrifying. Pitan quickly looked at the Spiral Steel Snake's magic card and found that its magic power had only decreased by less than 100 points after this normal attack. He quickly focused on continuing his summoning. However, after the apple-wrapped dragon realized that its attack was not effective, it suddenly let out a long cry and summoned a bright red apple out of thin air. The apple appeared high up in the sky and fell rapidly, heavily smashing into the Spiral Steel Snake's head. The Steel Shell Beast's high defense that it had painstakingly accumulated was reduced by half under the Universal Gravity's Sure Kill skill. At this moment, the apple-wrapped dragon once again revealed its claws and fangs. It tore through the Spiral Steel Snake's defense like a piece of paper. The Spiral Steel Snake, that had parasitized the Steel Shell Beast, together with the Steel Shell Beast, turned into magic light spots on the spot and dissipated outwards. Pitan's chanting came to an abrupt end. The apple-wrapped dragon's dragon horn had already hit the blue cube magic ball. The life barrier with only 4,000 points of magic power could not withstand the apple-wrapped dragon's two normal attacks. Pitan hurriedly stopped chanting and released his magic power, pulling the blue cube magic ball up into the sky. However, after the apple-wrapped dragon let out an excited cry, it flapped its wings fiercely and chased after it. Meanwhile, in the red square summoning area, Dake Dimming, who used all his strength even when a lion was hunting a rabbit, had already summoned Meow Meow. The gray cat hugged its chest and guarded in front of the magic ball, squinting at the apple-wrapped dragon that was full of vitality. It suddenly had the artistic urge to use an apple to carve the apple-wrapped dragon. Dake had already extended his finger and shot out magic power lines, interfering with the blue cube magic ball's manipulation. Under the interference, the apple-wrapped dragon quickly caught up with the blue cube magic ball. 40000, and damn it. In the end, Pitan, who could not withstand the first round, was so angry that he slammed the table. In the end, he did not make the Spinach Gang pay back. However, this was definitely not his fault. It was just that the apple-sized dragon was too much. "Hey, Pitan, where's your secret weapon?" The voice from the other side calmed Pitan down. He said stubbornly, "Bad luck, next time." Dake smiled and said, "You can't draw all the magic cards you want in the preparation stage, right? I'm looking forward to seeing your secret weapon next time. Okay, definitely. Pitan could not help but laugh dryly. You smiled, and so did I. The duel brought smiles to all of us. The battle is over. Winner, Dake Dimming. With the referee's announcement, the duel was finally over. After Dake put the apple-wrapped dragon back into the magic card, he stepped down from the stage and returned to Deanna and Luo C's side. However, he did not stay in the ring for too long. He grabbed his backpack and headed to the library. He already had a clue on how to make the clown mask. As long as he looked for some books, he could start researching the formula of the softening agent and write the magic language to refine the clown mask. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. Dake arrived at the open-air dueling arena early in the morning. Today's duels were scheduled for the morning and afternoon. Both of his opponents were students from the School of Magic. Among the 4 schools in the 2nd grade, the students from the School of Magic had a higher ability to learn independently. Although some of them kept a low profile, they were still able to make magic cards that could not be underestimated. Dake's opponent in the morning's duel was the 2nd-year head of the School of Magic, Heidi Euphemia. Heidi was Saraswati's little follower, so Dake was no stranger to her. However, Dake had never fought her before. This duel for the Silver Cup could be considered the first time for both of them. Heidi's expression was very serious. She untied the 2 thick braids that always hung in front of her chest and combed them into a standard matronly hairstyle. Her entire temperament had changed considerably. At least it seemed that she had the aura of a head of a school. Saraswati, who was watching from the ring, nodded with satisfaction. She was quite confident in her own skills. On the other hand, Doran, who was sitting on the other side, was a little stunned. Pitan forcefully poked his waist. Ouch! As he cried out in pain, both contestants had already placed their cards into the slots. The projection of the preparation stage appeared in the air. Dake only greeted Heidi briefly before he focused his attention on the duel. In order to deal with Heidi, he rearranged the deck last night and reduced the number of cards in the deck again. In the past, Heidi's performance was almost the epitome of Sarah's. If he didn't stay on guard, even he would have the possibility of being defeated. Beep. Preparation stage. 30s. Both contestants took out 5 magic cards from the top of the deck at the same time. 23/127. Good morning. Looking for a guaranteed monthly ticket and a guaranteed blade. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.